The night I opened my husband's secret safe, my hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. After 38 years of marriage, after raising his children and ironing his shirts and believing every word out of his mouth, you'd think discovering that the man you loved had been robbing you blind for decades would make your hands shake. Mine were perfectly still. Because by the time I found the cash, the accounts, the deeds, the name I didn't recognize, I wasn't devastated anymore. I was done. And I already knew exactly what I was going to leave inside that safe. If this story speaks to something you've lived through, or something you were afraid to name, stay with me until the very end. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I want to start with the woman I used to be, because I think that matters. Not the woman I became after all of this. The woman before. Her name was Evelyn Mercer, though most people called her Evie. She was 61 years old, 5'4", with silver hair she'd stopped fighting about 7 years earlier, and a laugh that people said could warm up a cold room. She made good coffee. She remembered everybody's birthday. She kept the kind of house where the curtains always matched the season and there was always something on the stove. She believed in her husband. That's the most important thing to understand about her. For 38 years, Evelyn Mercer believed in Graham Mercer the way some people believe in the weather. Completely, instinctively, without ever stopping to question whether the forecast might be wrong. She trusted him because he was trustworthy, or so she thought, because he was calm in every crisis, reasonable in every argument, because he never raised his voice and never lost his temper, and always had an explanation for everything. What she didn't know, not yet, was that a man who always has an explanation is sometimes a man who's been rehearsing one. We met in the autumn of 1986. I was 23 years old, freshly graduated with a degree in elementary education, and I was substitute teaching at a middle school in Evanston while I waited for a full-time position to open up. He was 27, already 3 years into what would become a very successful career in financial consulting, and he had that particular kind of confidence that 23-year-old women often mistake for security. Not arrogance. Graham was never arrogant. Arrogance announces itself. Graham's confidence was quieter than that. It was the kind that made you feel like the most important person in the room when he turned it on you. Like he'd assessed the entire crowd and chosen you. Our first date was dinner at a restaurant I couldn't afford, but he insisted on. He ordered for both of us, which I remember thinking was slightly old-fashioned, but also oddly reassuring. He knew what he wanted. He was decisive. He made you feel like things were being handled. I was 23. I thought that was what love felt like. We were married 14 months later in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. My mother cried. My father shook Graham's hand for a very long time and said, "You take care of her." And Graham looked him straight in the eye and said, "Sir, that's exactly what I intend to do." I thought about those words so many times over the years. That's exactly what I intend to do. The thing is, he was right. He did take care of me. He was just also, simultaneously, taking care of himself, in ways I wouldn't discover for nearly 4 decades. The early years were good. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy and wrong to look back and paint the whole marriage black from the beginning. That's not what happened. The early years were genuinely good. We were happy, the way young couples are happy, imperfectly and noisily, with arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes and late nights talking in bed and small rituals that became the architecture of a shared life. Connor was born in 1989, Natalie in 1992. And that's when things began to shift. Slowly. So slowly I didn't even notice it happening. I had always planned to go back to teaching after Natalie was born. That was the plan. Graham's income was stable enough that I could take a year off, be home with both kids for that first stretch, and then return to the classroom. The year became 2 years. 2 years became 5. "You're so good with them," Graham would say. "They need you home. We can afford it, Evie. Why would you want to rush back?" He made it sound like a gift, like staying home was something he was giving me. And I suppose I let him. I let him frame it that way because the truth is, I loved being home with my kids. I loved the chaos of it, the noise, the drawings stuck to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets, the way Connor smelled after a bath, the sound of Natalie laughing in her sleep. I don't regret any of that. What I regret is what I didn't notice while I was loving all of it. I didn't notice that as the years passed and the children grew, Graham became increasingly the sole authority on anything related to money. I didn't notice that when I asked questions about our finances, his answers were always technically sufficient, but somehow never quite complete. I didn't notice that my name was absent from certain accounts, certain documents, certain decisions that I assumed we were making together. I didn't notice because I trusted him. That word again, trusted. I'm going to be repeating it for a while, and I want you to notice how it changes meaning each time. By the time our kids were in high school, I had stopped asking about money altogether. It had happened so gradually that I genuinely couldn't have told you when. Somewhere between Natalie's orthodontist bills and Connor's college applications, I had simply handed the whole thing over. Not dramatically, not with a conversation, just by degree, question by question, until there were no more questions. Graham managed everything: the mortgage, the investments, the retirement accounts, the insurance, the taxes. He handled it all with the quiet efficiency of a man who found financial management deeply satisfying, which, given that it was literally his profession, made perfect sense to me. He gave me a household account. A generous one, I thought. $3,000 a month for groceries, utilities, household expenses, and whatever I needed personally. If I needed more for something larger, a car repair, a medical expense, I'd tell Graham and he'd transfer the funds. It felt reasonable. It felt like a partnership. What it actually was, I understand now, was a very sophisticated form of financial control. I had just enough independence to feel free, and just enough dependence to stay manageable. But I didn't know that then. What? The first cracks appeared in February of last year. Natalie called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and the moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. My daughter had her father's composure. She didn't cry easily, didn't panic, kept things close to her chest until she absolutely had to let them out. So when I heard the roughness in her voice, the careful steadiness of someone trying very hard not to fall apart, my stomach dropped immediately. "Mom," she said, "I need to talk to you and Dad." She drove out to the house that Saturday. Connor came too, which surprised me. Natalie must have called him, which meant this was serious enough that she didn't want to face it alone. We sat in the living room, the same living room where I'd watched those kids take their first steps and open their Christmas presents and argue over the remote control for 20-something years. And Natalie, who was 32 years old and had always seemed so certain about her life, told us that her marriage to Derek was over. "It's been bad for a long time," she said, her voice steady but her hands in her lap, fingers pressed together the way she used to press them as a little girl when she was nervous. "We tried counseling. It didn't help. I need to leave, and I need some help getting on my feet, just for a few months." She looked at her father when she said it. We all did. Graham was quiet for a moment. He had a way of going very still before he spoke, like he was measuring his words. I'd always read it as thoughtfulness. I was learning to read it differently. "How much are we talking about?" he said. Natalie blinked. I don't know exactly. Enough for a security deposit and a few months' rent while I sort out the legal side. Maybe $15,000. I'd pay it back." The room went silent. I watched Graham's face do that particular thing it did when he'd already made a decision and was simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. A slight settling of the jaw. A micro-adjustment of the shoulders. "Natalie," he said, and his voice was so gentle, so kind. "I wish I could. I really do. But your mother and I are in a tight spot right now. The market's been difficult. We're trying to protect our own retirement. It wouldn't be responsible." I remember nodding. In that moment, I actually nodded. My daughter was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as a kind of quiet drowning. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just a person who needs a lifeboat and is watching it drift past. And I nodded, because I believed him. Natalie and Connor left by early evening. The drive home was longer for both of them than it needed to be, I think. I stood at the front door watching their headlights disappear down the street, and something small and cold settled in my chest. Not suspicion. Not yet. Just a feeling I couldn't name. I went back inside. Graham was in his office, the door pulled halfway shut the way it usually was in the evenings. I could hear him on the phone, his voice low and easy, The tone he used with clients when things were going well. Easy, comfortable. I went to bed. I lay in the dark and I thought about Natalie's hands pressed together in her lap. Yes, 3 days later I found the statement. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of television-style revelation, no glowing envelope left in the open, no mysterious file folder. It was just a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I was looking for a pen in the drawer of the small table in the hallway, the catch-all drawer, the kind every house has, full of rubber bands and old cough drops and dead batteries, and underneath a folded pizza delivery menu from a restaurant that closed 3 years ago, my hand closed around a piece of paper. I almost put it back without looking. I almost did. But something made me unfold it. It was a bank statement, not one of ours. Not from the joint account, not from any account I recognized. The institution was a small private bank I'd never heard of, based in the suburbs north of the city. The account holder was listed as Graham D. Mercer. His name. Not our names. His name alone. And the balance at the bottom of the page, the number that stopped my breath entirely, was $214,000. I stood in the hallway for a long time. The paper was dated 8 months earlier, which meant this wasn't new. Whatever this was, it had existed for at least 8 months, possibly much longer. And Graham had never mentioned it, not once. Not in a single conversation about our finances, our retirement, our tight spot, $214,000. We can't afford to help her. I put the statement back under the pizza menu. I smoothed it flat. I closed the drawer. And I stood in my own hallway, in my own house, and felt the first real tremor of something that I didn't have a word for yet. Not anger, not even betrayal, just the cold, vertiginous feeling of a floor that might not be as solid as you thought it was. I didn't say anything to Graham that night. This surprises people when I tell them. They want to know why I didn't confront him immediately, why I didn't march into his office and slam the statement on his desk and demand an explanation. And I understand that impulse. Part of me wanted that too. But something stopped me. Some instinct I didn't fully understand at the time. Because here's what I knew about Graham Mercer after 38 years of marriage. He was very, very good at explaining things. He was the kind of man who could take your worst fear, hold it up to the light, turn it around twice, and hand it back to you, looking like a misunderstanding. He was calm in the face of accusations the way some people are calm in bad weather. He'd just waited out so many storms that he knew they always passed. If I confronted him that night with nothing but a single statement and a shaking voice, he would explain it. He would have a reason, a good one. And I would believe it the way I had believed everything else, because that's what I did. I needed more than one piece of paper. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I said a single word. So I started watching. It felt strange at first, surveilling the man I shared a bed with, paying careful attention to things I'd spent decades not noticing. But once I started, I couldn't stop. I noticed that Graham took phone calls in his office with the door closed, which wasn't unusual in itself. He'd always done that. But now I noticed how he positioned himself when he closed the door. He'd check the hallway first, quickly, casually, like he wasn't really checking. But he was. I noticed that the shredder in his office ran more frequently than it used to. I could hear it from the kitchen, that particular mechanical grinding of documents being destroyed, and I started to keep track of when it happened. Evenings, Saturday mornings, whenever I told him I was going out for a few hours. I noticed that he had started picking up the mail himself, which he never used to do. For years, mail was my department. Now it was his. He'd get up from wherever he was the moment the mail truck came, and he'd go through it in his office before anything made it to the kitchen table. I noticed all of this, and I said nothing. I watched, and I waited, and I thought about my daughter's hands pressed together in her lap. It was on a Thursday night, about 3 weeks after I found the statement, that I saw the safe. I couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. I'd been sleeping badly for weeks, lying awake beside my husband while my mind ran quiet circles around things I wasn't ready to name. Around 2 a.m, I got up for a glass of water, padding down the hallway, in the dark the way you do in a house you've lived in long enough that you don't need lights to navigate it. Graham's office door was open. This was unusual. He almost never left it open. I stood in the hallway and looked in. He was at the filing cabinet on the far wall. The old steel one, the gray one he'd had for as long as I could remember, stacked with folders and professional binders. And as I watched, he did something that took me a moment to process. He moved the cabinet, not far, just a foot, maybe 18 inches, swinging it out from the wall on what I could now see was some kind of recessed roller system, the kind that's built into the floor. And behind it, set flush into the wall, was a safe. Small and dark and utterly invisible until you knew it was there. Graham crouched in front of it. I watched the deliberate movement of his right hand, a specific sequence, careful and practiced. And then I heard the click. He opened it for perhaps 90 seconds. I couldn't see what he was looking at from the hallway. Then he closed it, spun the dial, and moved the cabinet back into place. He turned around. I was already gone. I was back in the bedroom, under the covers, eyes closed, heart slamming against my ribs like something trying to get out. I heard him walk past in the hallway, heard him go to the kitchen, run the water, come back. He got into bed beside me. "Evie," he said softly. I said, not moving. "Go back to sleep." I lay there in the dark and I thought, I need to know what's in that safe. It took me another 2 weeks to see the combination. That's not a small thing. I want you to understand the particular kind of patience it required. I'm not a naturally suspicious person. I'm not someone who schemes or strategizes. Before all of this, the most calculated thing I did on a regular basis was plan the Thanksgiving menu. But something had changed in me since that night in the hallway. Something had sharpened. I started finding reasons to be in the office when Graham was home. Not suspiciously, just dropping things off, asking questions, standing in the doorway to chat while he worked. I was mapping the room, looking at that filing cabinet and thinking about what was behind it. And then one evening, Graham's phone rang while he was in the middle of opening the safe. He hadn't heard me come down the stairs, hadn't done his usual check of the hallway. And I was at the kitchen end of the hall when I heard the filing cabinet move. I moved quietly toward the office. The door was open 4 inches. Not enough for him to see me, enough for me to see him. He was on the phone, distracted, and he opened the safe one-handed, his right hand moving through the combination without thinking about it, the automatic way you dial a number you've dialed 1,000 times. I watched his hand. I memorized what I saw. 3 numbers, left, right, left. I went back to the kitchen and I wrote them on the inside of my wrist in ballpoint pen, and I stood at the sink washing dishes with my right hand turned carefully inward so the ink wouldn't smear against the counter. Shemts. I sat with that combination for 9 days. 9 days of making dinner and asking about his work, and watching him watch the news and folding his laundry, and holding the combination inside me like something radioactive. I didn't tell anyone. Not Connor, not Natalie. Especially not Natalie, who was staying with a friend and trying to put her own life back together. I thought about what would happen if I opened that safe and found nothing remarkable. A gun, maybe. Important documents. The kind of things people keep in safes. I thought about how I would feel, relieved or foolish or both. I thought about what would happen if I found something else. On the 9th day, Graham told me he was going to the club on Saturday morning, golf with a client, home by 2 at the earliest. Saturday morning. I said, "Have a good game." Boatam. He left at 8:15. I gave it 30 minutes. Then I walked down the hallway to his office, put both hands on the filing cabinet, and swung it out from the wall. The roller mechanism was smoother than I expected. Quiet. The safe was smaller than I remembered from that night, or maybe I'd imagined it larger. Dark gray, recessed into the drywall, with a simple combination dial. I crouched in front of it. My hands were steady. I noticed that. Even then, I noticed my hands were completely still. I dialed the combination, left, right, left. The click was soft. I opened the door, and I understood in the space of about 10 seconds that my entire life had been something other than what I believed it was. The safe was deep, deeper than the door suggested, and it was full. Banded stacks of cash. I didn't count them, but I could see there were many different denominations. Behind the cash, folders, thick manila folders with handwritten labels, investment portfolios, account statements from institutions I didn't recognize, property records, actual deeds with addresses in states I had no idea we owned anything in, transfer records from accounts that weren't in my name or our joint name, but were labeled with numbers that clearly meant something to someone. And toward the back, paperclipped to a thick document, a name, Vanessa Holloway. I didn't know that name. I didn't recognize it from anywhere in our 38 years together. But her name was on a lot of those papers. I sat on the floor of my husband's office, surrounded by evidence of a life he had built alongside mine without my knowledge, and I stayed very still. Because I had to think. I had to be very, very smart about what came next. I didn't take anything. Not yet. I photographed everything with my phone, every document, every statement, every page I could identify. My hand stayed steady through all of it. I worked methodically, like I was doing something routine, like I was taking inventory of the linen closet. When I was done, I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I closed the safe. I dialed it. I moved the filing cabinet back into place. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the table where I had eaten 38 years of breakfast, and I drank my tea, and I looked out the window at the backyard. The garden I'd planted, the oak tree Connor had climbed as a kid, the spot near the fence where Natalie used to set up her little outdoor tea sets when she was 4. The life I had built in this house was real. My children were real. The love I'd had for this man, some version of it somewhere, was real. But the partnership I thought I was living in, that had never existed. Graham Mercer had been running a parallel life, a financial life, a future that was his alone, constructed so carefully and so quietly that 38 years had passed and I had never once suspected. I finished my tea. Then I picked up my phone and searched for the name of the best divorce attorney in Cook County. No, her name was Diane Keller, and she had an office in a glass building downtown that felt deliberately designed to make you feel like you were in capable hands. She was in her mid-50s, compact and direct, with reading glasses she pushed up into her hair when she wasn't using them, and the kind of focused attention that made you feel like the most important case she'd ever had. I sat across from her on a Tuesday morning while Graham thought I was having lunch with a friend from my old book club, and I laid my phone on the desk and slid it toward her. She looked at the photos. She was quiet for a long time. "How long have you been married?" she asked. 38 years. She looked up at me. "And in 38 years you had no idea any of this existed?" "No," I said. "None." Something moved across her face. Not surprise. I got the impression that Diane Keller was not easily surprised. More like a particular kind of professional recognition. She'd seen something like this before. "Mrs. Mercer," she said carefully, "what your husband appears to have done is extremely deliberate. These aren't forgotten accounts or clerical oversights. The structure of this," she gestured at the phone, "is designed. Someone with his expertise in finance would know exactly what he was doing." "I know," I said. "Do you understand what this means for your marriage?" "I think so," I said, "but I'd like you to explain it to me anyway." So she did. She talked for a long time, about marital assets and separate property, about the legal obligations of financial disclosure in divorce proceedings, about what happens when one spouse deliberately conceals assets from the other. "The courts don't look kindly on it," she said. That's a significant understatement, as it turned out. She talked about what I was entitled to. I listened to all of it. I asked my questions. I took notes. And at the end, when she asked me what I wanted to do, I was quiet for a moment. "I want to make sure he can't move anything before I file," I said. "Is that possible?" "It's not only possible," Diane said. "It's necessary." She told me what we needed. She told me the timeline. She told me that the photographs were a good start, but that she'd want a forensic accountant to go through everything properly once we had access through discovery. I nodded. I wrote it all down. "Mrs. Mercer," Diane said as I was putting on my coat to leave, "can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "How are you doing with all of this?" I thought about it honestly. "I'm angry," I said, "but I'm also very clear. Clearer than I've been in years, actually. Maybe in decades." She studied me for a moment. "Good," she said. Clear is exactly what you need to be right now, Shat. I drove home along the lakeshore, the water gray and cold under an early April sky. And I thought about my daughter. I thought about Natalie sitting in my living room with her hands pressed together, asking for $15,000, and Graham saying we're in a tight spot right now with $214,000 in a private account, and God knows how much more in a safe behind a hidden filing cabinet. I thought about 38 years of coupons, 38 years of we should be careful, 38 years of a woman who gave up her career, her financial independence, her name from certain documents she should have been on, because she believed her husband when he said they were in this together. The anger I'd mentioned to Diane was there, but underneath it was something else, something quieter and more complicated. Grief, maybe. Not grief for my marriage. I was starting to understand that the marriage I was grieving had never quite existed. Grief for the woman I might have been, if I had known. I turned the car away from the lakeshore and drove home. Graham's car wasn't in the driveway yet. I went inside. I started making dinner, and in my coat pocket, my phone held photographs of a secret life. And in my head, a divorce attorney's voice laid out the shape of what came next. That night, Graham came home from what he'd said was a client dinner and found me reading at the kitchen table. "Good book?" he said, hanging up his coat. I said. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man with nothing particular on his mind. "You seem quiet," he said. "I'm fine," I said. "Tired." He came over and kissed me on the top of my head. "Go to bed. You've been looking worn out lately." "I will," I said. "In a minute." He went upstairs. I sat at the table and looked at the words on the page in front of me without reading a single one, because I had made a decision. Not about what I was going to do. I already knew what I was going to do. The decision was about how. Graham Mercer had spent almost 4 decades keeping his secrets in a place he thought I'd never find. A safe, locked and hidden, behind a cabinet that moved on hidden wheels, concealed in a room where I was rarely welcome. He had hidden his truth from me in that safe. It seemed only right, when the time came, to use the same place to deliver mine. The days after my meeting with Diane Keller had a strange double quality to them. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. I made breakfast. I did laundry. I asked Graham how his meetings went and listened to his answers with the same attentive expression I'd worn for 38 years. I laughed at the right moments. I passed the salt. I said goodnight. But underneath all of it, something fundamental had shifted, the way a foundation shifts after a flood, invisible from the outside, catastrophic from within. Every conversation I had with my husband now carried a second conversation running parallel to it inside my head. Every time he mentioned money, or the market, or being careful, I heard it differently than I used to. I heard it the way you hear a song after you've learned what the lyrics actually mean. He said, "I'm worried about inflation eating into our savings," and I thought about $214,000 in a private account. He said, "We should probably cut back on eating out this month." And I thought about property deeds in states I'd never visited. He said, "I love you, Evie." And I sat very still and wondered what that had ever meant coming from him. I didn't confront him. I wasn't ready. And more than that, I was starting to understand that readiness wasn't the issue. Strategy was. If I confronted Graham before Diane had everything she needed, before the financial picture was fully documented, I would be handing him a warning. And a man who had spent 4 decades quietly moving money through invisible channels would know exactly what to do with a warning. So I kept my face calm and my voice normal, and I sat across from him at dinner every night, and I waited. Waiting was the hardest thing I had ever done, harder, even, than what came after. There was one evening, a Wednesday, I think, maybe 10 days after I'd opened the safe, when Graham reached across the table and covered my hand with his. Just that. No particular reason. He was watching something on the small television in the kitchen, some news program he liked, and he just reached over and put his hand on mine the way he'd done 10,000 times before, and I felt it. Not warmth, not love. Something more complicated and much more painful. Muscle memory, maybe. 38 years of small gestures accumulating into something your body responds to before your brain has a chance to catch up. My eyes stung. I blinked. "You okay?" he said, not looking away from the screen. "Fine," I said. "Onion from earlier." He patted my hand once and went back to the news. And I sat there with burning eyes and thought, even now, even knowing what I know, part of me still wishes this were simple. Part of me still wishes there were an explanation that made sense of everything, that it was a misunderstanding, a mistake, something innocent. But $214,000 doesn't sit in a secret account by accident. A hidden safe full of offshore transfers and someone else's name doesn't get built by mistake. Some things are exactly what they look like. I was just very late learning to look. I had told Diane I needed to understand who Vanessa Holloway was before we moved forward. She had cautioned me, gently, professionally, in the way lawyers caution clients when they sense that the client is about to do something the lawyer cannot officially endorse. She said that any contact with individuals who might be connected to the financial structures we were investigating could complicate the legal process. She said I should let her team handle the background research. I said I understood. Then I went home and spent 2 evenings searching every public record I could find for a woman named Vanessa Holloway in the greater Chicago metropolitan area. I found her. She wasn't difficult to find, which told me something. If she were truly a hidden figure, a ghost built to conceal Graham's money, she would have been harder to locate. Instead, she appeared in property records, in business registration documents, in the kind of mundane public footprint that ordinary people accumulate without thinking about it. Vanessa Holloway, age 54. A business address in Rockford, about 90 miles northwest of Chicago. Listed as the registered agent for no fewer than 4 limited liability companies, all of them with generic names. The kind of names that don't tell you anything about what the company actually does. Horizon Holdings, LLC, Clearfield Asset Management, Lakeview Consulting Group, Northbrook Realty Partners. Each of those names appeared in the documents I'd photographed in Graham's safe. I wrote the Rockford address on a piece of paper. I looked at it for a long time. Then I wrote down the distance. 90 miles, less than 2 hours. I told Graham I was visiting an old friend in Elgin for the day. He said, "Have a good time." He didn't look up from his laptop. I drove to Rockford on a Thursday morning in early May, with the windows down because the weather had finally turned warm enough to let spring in. Route 20 took me through small towns and flat farmland, the sky enormous and pale blue, the way it gets in Illinois when the humidity hasn't settled in yet. Under other circumstances, it would have been a pleasant drive. I spent most of it trying to figure out what I was going to say. I didn't have a plan exactly. I had an address and a name and a gut feeling that Diane's investigators, however thorough, would find documents and records but not the story. The story was what I needed, because I had learned, in the past several weeks, that documents can tell you what happened. They can't always tell you why. The address was a small commercial building on the edge of a modest business park. The kind of place that houses insurance offices and accounting firms and small regional consulting operations. Vanessa Holloway's office was on the second floor, Suite 204, according to the building directory in the lobby. I took the stairs. I knocked. The woman who opened the door was not what I had expected, though I couldn't have told you precisely what I was expecting. She was medium height, trim, with dark hair shot through with silver that she wore pulled back simply. She was dressed practically. Dark slacks, a pale blue blouse, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked like someone's competent older sister, like someone who handled things. She looked at me, and something happened in her face that was very hard to read. A rapid sequence of emotions moving through her eyes before she got them under control. Recognition wasn't one of them, but something close to it. Something like the look on a person's face when they open a door and find standing there the thing they've been half expecting for a very long time. "Can I help you?" she said. "I think so," I said. "My name is Evelyn Mercer. I'm Graham Mercer's wife." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. I counted them. "You'd better come in," she said. No, her office was tidy and impersonal, the kind of space that gives nothing away about the person who works in it. A desk, a filing cabinet, 2 chairs for visitors, a window overlooking the parking lot, a framed print on the wall that was clearly chosen to be inoffensive. The only personal touch was a small photograph on the corner of the desk, turned at an angle so I couldn't see it clearly. She poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine on a side table without asking whether I wanted any. She set one in front of me and sat down behind her desk, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as resigned. "How did you find me?" she said. "Property records?" I said. "And your name in my husband's safe." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had changed in her face. The careful blankness had given way to something more human, more tired. "I've been waiting for this," she said quietly. "Not specifically you, but something like this. For a while now." "Then you can imagine," I said, "that I have some questions." "I can," she said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," I said. "Starting with how you know my husband." She told me. I said, "It took almost 2 hours. I sat in that visitor's chair, and I drank my coffee, and I listened to Vanessa Holloway tell me a story that I needed to hear and could not fully absorb, not all at once, the way you can't absorb cold water when you're standing in a hot room. You take in what you can, and the rest hits you later. She had met Graham 11 years earlier. Not romantically. She wanted to be clear about that immediately and explicitly, leaning forward in her chair, meeting my eyes. Never romantically. He had been referred to her by a mutual professional contact, a financial broker who moved in the same circles Graham did. "He came to me with a proposition," she said. "He said he needed someone with a clean professional history and no personal connection to his business dealings to serve as the registered agent for several holding companies he was setting up. The compensation was generous. The role was supposedly minimal. I'd be a name on documents, essentially. A legal formality." "And you agreed," I said. She hesitated. "I agreed to the first one. And then there was another one, and somewhere along the way I went from being a name on a document to being more involved than I'd intended." She looked down at her cup. "I should have asked more questions at the beginning. I know that. I tell myself that regularly." "What kind of more involved?" I said. "Signing off on asset transfers, holding deed titles temporarily during restructuring periods. Things that were legal technically, but that I understood eventually, were designed to make certain assets harder to trace, harder to include in a consolidated marital estate." The phrase landed with its full weight. Marital estate. She knew what this was. She'd known for a long time. "Did he tell you he was married?" I asked. "Yes. He mentioned his wife early on. He described the marriage as, he said you had an agreement, that your finances were deliberately separate for tax purposes, and that you were aware of the structures." I sat very still. "He said I knew. He said you'd both agreed it was cleaner this way." Her voice was careful. I believed him, for longer than I should have, and then, about 4 years ago, I started doing my own research, into the structures, into what they actually were. She paused. I became concerned. "Concerned," I repeated. "That's a careful word." "I'm a careful person," she said. "But yes, what I found when I looked properly was that these weren't tax structures. They were exit structures, money being positioned piece by piece in ways that would be very difficult for a spouse to claim in a divorce proceeding." She looked at me directly. "I confronted Graham about it, about 4 years ago." "What did he say?" "He said I'd misunderstood. He was very calm, very reassuring. He had an explanation for everything, the way he always does." A brief, humorless expression crossed her face. I wanted to believe him. It was easier. I had already signed a lot of documents by then. My hands were around my own cup. I focused on the warmth of it. "But you didn't fully believe him," I said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "I didn't. Not entirely. But I told myself it was none of my business, that I didn't have proof of anything specifically wrong, that I should just let it be." She stopped, looked at the window. "And then 6 months ago, he brought me a new set of documents to sign. A real estate transfer, a property in Wisconsin, moved into one of the LLCs. And there was something in the paperwork that I hadn't seen before, a timeline. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Not a thick one, just a few pages. She set it on the desk between us. "He left this in a packet of materials I was supposed to sign," she said. "I don't think it was meant for me to see. I think he put it in the wrong envelope." I looked at the folder. "What's in it?" I said. "He called it a postmarital asset strategy," she said. "A timeline and a plan for how he intended to restructure his life after the marriage ended." The room was very quiet. "He planned to leave me," I said. "He planned to leave you with as little as legally and arguably illegally possible," she said, "and he'd been executing that plan for years." I reached out and opened the folder. I won't describe every detail of what was in those pages, partly because the legal proceedings that followed would eventually catalog it all with far more precision than my memory could, but partly because some things, when you read them, leave a mark that doesn't benefit from being re-examined at length. It was handwritten. That was the first thing that struck me. Not typed, not formatted, handwritten, in Graham's neat, precise penmanship that I would have recognized anywhere. The same handwriting that had signed my birthday cards, that had written notes in the margins of the books we shared, that had written "I love you" on paper napkins slipped into my coat pocket on cold mornings early in our marriage. That same handwriting had outlined over several pages how to construct a financial reality in which a woman who had given 38 years to a marriage would emerge from it with as little as possible. There was a timeline. It was specific. It had a target year, and that year was close. Within the next 18 months. There was a list of assets. Beside each asset, a notation about its current accessibility and what would need to happen to move it beyond the reach of a divorce settlement. And at the bottom of the last page, a single line that I read twice because I needed to make sure I'd read it correctly. "He is not a sophisticated financial actor. She will accept whatever is presented as fair. E. Evelyn." Me. He had written about me in his planning documents the way you write about a variable in an equation, a factor to be accounted for, a predictable quantity. She will accept whatever is presented as fair. I closed the folder. I looked at Vanessa Holloway, who was watching me with an expression that I recognized. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has been carrying a weight and is watching someone else finally learn why the weight exists. "Can I take this?" I said. "I made copies," she said. "That one is yours." I picked up the folder. My hands were steady. I was noticing that more and more, that my hands were steady even when everything else in me was not. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. She was quiet for a moment. "Because I was afraid," she said, "and because I told myself it wasn't my place, and because, honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd be walking into. Whether you knew more than you seemed to, whether coming to you would make things worse." She paused. "Those were excuses. I know that. The real answer is that it was easier not to." I nodded. I understood easier not to. I had been living that answer myself for more than 3 decades. "There's something else," she said. I looked up. She reached back into the drawer and produced another document. This one was a single page, a printed email exchange dated 14 months earlier. "He reached out to a contact of his," she said, "someone in private banking. He was asking about the process for establishing residency in a jurisdiction with favorable asset protection laws. He mentioned," she tapped the page, "here. He mentioned a specific timeline and referred to a personal situation that was nearing resolution. 14 months ago. Around the time Natalie had called me saying her marriage was falling apart. Around the time Graham had looked his daughter in the eye and said, 'We simply cannot afford to help you.' He'd been finalizing his escape plan at the same time he was refusing to give his daughter $15,000. I don't have a word for what I felt in that moment. Not anger. Anger is too small and too hot. This was something colder and larger, something that sits in your chest and takes up all the air. "May I keep this too?" I said. "Please," she said. We sat in her office for a few more minutes after that, not talking much. The particular silence of 2 women who have been, in very different ways, involved in the same deception and are only now in the same room together. Before I left, I asked her one more question. Did you ever like him? I said. As a person. Setting aside all of this, did you ever think he was a good man? She considered this honestly. I appreciated that she didn't answer immediately. He's very charming, she said finally. Very capable. Very convincing. In the beginning, yes. I thought he was smart and interesting, and that I was lucky to have a professional association with someone of his caliber. She paused. But charm that's always switched on is its own kind of warning sign. I just learned that lesson too late. So did I said. I shook her hand at the door. It was strange, shaking hands with someone whose name I had found in a hidden safe, someone who had been, without knowing me at all, a component in a machine designed to diminish my future. She wasn't a villain. That was the complicated part. She was a woman who had made convenient choices and had spent years not looking too closely at the cost of that convenience. I understood that impulse better than I wanted to. What will you do? I asked her. When this goes through, legally. Cooperate, she said without hesitation. Fully. I should have done it sooner. I drove back to Chicago with 2 folders on the passenger seat and the windows still down, the warm May air moving through the car, and for a long time I didn't think about anything specific. I just drove. I let the road and the flat green fields and the enormous pale sky fill up the space where my thoughts usually lived. I called Diane from a gas station parking lot 40 miles outside the city. I need to see you tomorrow, I said. What happened? A brief pause. Did you do something I told you not to do? Technically, I said, but I brought you something you're going to want. Another pause. Shorter. My 9 o'clock canceled, she said. Be here at 9. Shut. Diane did not lecture me. She looked at the handwritten documents. She looked at the email exchange. She called someone on her team while I sat in the same chair as before, and when she got off the phone, she set her glasses down on the desk and looked at me in a way that I found oddly satisfying. This changes the scope of what we're dealing with, she said. I know. Considerably. I know. Evelyn? She leaned forward slightly. What he put in writing, the post-marital asset strategy, that phrase, combined with the documented offshore transfers and the shell company structures, this isn't just aggressive financial planning. This is potentially fraudulent concealment. The court will not be sympathetic. Good, I said. It also means we need to move faster than I'd initially planned. If he realizes you've been to Rockford, he doesn't know, I said. He thinks I was in Elgin. And how long can you maintain that? I thought about it. About dinner tables and passing the salt in hands covered in mine while the news played on the kitchen television. Long enough, I said. Diane studied me for a moment. You're holding up remarkably well for someone whose life just got turned upside down, I finished. It got turned upside down weeks ago. I just didn't have the full picture yet. I straightened in the chair. What I need now is to understand the timeline. When do we file? What happens when we file? And I paused. I want to talk to you about something specific, about how I want him to receive the papers. Diane raised an eyebrow. That's unusual, she said. I know, I said. Hear me out. I'd been thinking about the safe since the morning I'd opened it. I'd been thinking about the combination, left, right, left, and about the neat stacks of cash in the manila folders with their careful handwriting and the name of a woman Graham had recruited to help him disappear with our life savings. I'd been thinking about what it meant that he chose to keep his secrets there, in a place hidden behind a piece of furniture that moved on hidden wheels, in a room where I was rarely invited, behind a combination he'd never shared with me. He had chosen that safe as the repository of everything he intended to hide, all the planning, all the preparation, all the careful construction of a future that didn't include me. It seemed absolutely right to me that when the moment came, when the thing he'd been avoiding finally arrived, it should find him in the same place, not handed to him by a process server, not slid under the office door, not placed on the kitchen table for a conversation I wasn't prepared to have yet. Hidden in the safe, just as he had hidden everything from me. Let him find it the way I found the truth. Let him open the door he thought was only his, in the room he'd made only his, and find something waiting for him that changed everything. That's, Diane said slowly when I finished explaining, actually not legally complicated, as long as service of process has been properly executed first. We can arrange for official service, and then how you choose to deliver a personal copy is your business. Then let's talk about timing, I said. She almost smiled. Almost. Let's, she said. But the weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. Diane's team moved with a quiet efficiency that I found both impressive and quietly terrifying. The way it's terrifying to watch machinery you've set in motion and understand that there is no stopping it now. A forensic accountant was retained. Subpoenas were being prepared. The offshore structures, the shell companies, the property deeds in 3 states, all of it was being cataloged with a precision that Graham, despite his considerable financial expertise, had not anticipated. Because he had not anticipated that I would know to look. He is not a sophisticated financial actor. She will accept whatever is presented as fair. I thought about that line regularly. I let myself feel the sting of it, because I'd found that feeling the sting fully was better than suppressing it. Suppressed pain has a way of leaking out sideways, and I couldn't afford sideways. I needed direct. At home, I maintained the surface. It was exhausting in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer corresponds to the person inside. Every morning I woke up and assembled Evelyn Mercer, the wife, and carried her through the day. Every evening I set her aside. Graham noticed nothing, or if he did, he said nothing, which, I was learning, was not the same thing. One evening he came home from a client dinner talking about a couple he'd met, friends of a business contact, married 40 years, recently retired, doing a walking tour of Portugal. That's something we should think about, he said, after I wind down some of these client accounts. A real trip, not the small ones we've been doing. I looked up from the book I was pretending to read. He was pouring wine. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man with plans, future plans, horizon plans. That sounds nice, I said. He smiled at me over his shoulder, a real smile, or what passed for one with him, the warm, practiced, completely convincing smile of a man who had spent 40 years making people feel like he was being sincere. You deserve a real trip, Evie, he said. You really do. I looked back at my book. I know, I said quietly. He didn't hear the weight in it. He never had. That was, in the end, the most damaging thing about my husband. Not the hidden accounts, or the offshore transfers, or the years of careful theft. Those were bad enough, but the deepest wound was simpler than any of that. He had looked at me for 38 years and seen exactly what he expected to see. A woman who would accept whatever was presented as fair. A woman who asked no questions. A woman who clipped coupons and believed him and trusted him and was, in all the ways that mattered to him, entirely manageable. He had never really seen me, and so he never saw what was coming. On a Friday evening in late May, Diane called me on the cell phone I'd bought specifically for communications with her office. A small, prepaid thing I kept in the inside pocket of my winter coat, which hung at the back of my bedroom closet. Everything is ready, she said. We can file Monday morning. I was sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the door locked and the fan running. Graham was downstairs watching television. The sound of it came up through the floor, faint and familiar. And the service? I said. Process server Monday afternoon. He'll be served at his office. I nodded to myself. And then I'll handle the copy. Evelyn, she said. Her voice was careful. Whatever you're planning to do it calmly. Don't give him any reason to claim harassment or escalation. Just be steady. I've been steady for weeks, I said. I know you have. A pause. You've been remarkable, actually. I don't say that to every client. I didn't answer right away. Diane, I said, when this is over, when it's actually over, will you tell me honestly whether you've seen anything like this before? A marriage like this? Yes, she said without hesitating, more than once. And the women on the other side of it, the ones who went through it, were they okay? Eventually? A long pause, the kind that means someone is being honest instead of just reassuring. The ones who let themselves be angry first, she said finally. and then let themselves heal. Yes, they were better than okay. Most of them. Another beat. The key was, they stopped apologizing for knowing what they knew. I thought about that for a moment. Thank you, I said. Monday, she said. We begin Monday. I stayed on the edge of the tub after I hung up, listening to the television downstairs. Some nature documentary, it sounded like. Something about migration patterns. The announcer's voice was calm and authoritative, explaining the precise navigational instincts that guide animals across thousands of miles to exactly where they need to be. I listened to it for a minute. Then I stood up, unlocked the bathroom door, and went downstairs. What are you watching? I said, settling onto the far end of the sofa. Nature thing, Graham said, not looking up. Good timing. They're about to show the wildebeest crossing. I folded my legs beneath me. I watched the screen. Hundreds of animals crossing a river, moving through the current, fighting to stay upright, driven by something older than thought toward a destination they'd never seen but somehow always known was there. Graham reached over and put his hand on my knee. I let him. Because Monday was coming, and when it came, everything would be different. Everything had, in a way, already been different for weeks. I was the only one in this room who knew that. And there was a particular terrible power in knowing something that the person beside you doesn't. I had never wanted that kind of power. But since he'd given it to me, since he'd handed it to me by underestimating me so completely, so consistently, for so long, I intended to use it exactly once, and I intended to use it well. Monday came the way significant days always do, disguised as an ordinary one. I woke at 6:15, the same as always. Made coffee in the same pot, in the same kitchen, with the same view of the backyard where the oak tree was fully leafed out now, deep early summer green, the kind of green that only lasts about 3 weeks before the heat takes the brightness out of it. Graham came downstairs at 7, showered and dressed, his tie already knotted. He always knotted his tie before breakfast, which used to strike me as a small, endearing quirk, and now struck me as exactly the kind of control-oriented habit that made complete sense once you understood who he actually was. He poured his coffee. He sat across from me. He read something on his phone while I looked at the backyard. Busy day? I said. Couple of client calls this afternoon, he said without looking up. Might be home a little late. That's fine, I said. He looked up then, briefly, and gave me the small smile he gave me across the breakfast table most mornings, the comfortable, unthinking smile of a man who believes his life is completely under control. You seem tired, he said. Didn't sleep great, I said, which was true. Take it easy today, he said, and went back to his phone. He left at 7:45. I stood at the front window and watched his car back down the driveway, and I thought, this is the last Monday morning that will ever look like this one. By the end of today, the shape of everything will have changed, and neither of us will ever eat breakfast at that table the same way again. I stood at the window until his car disappeared around the corner. Then I went to the kitchen and washed both our coffee cups, because old habits don't know when they've been made obsolete. Ba-bum. Diane called at 11:17. We filed, she said, 30 minutes ago. I was sitting in the backyard. I'd taken my second cup of coffee outside and was sitting in the old Adirondack chair near the garden beds, the ones I'd planted with coneflowers and black-eyed Susans that wouldn't bloom until July. The morning was warm already, the kind of early summer day that tricks you into thinking the whole season will be like this. Okay, I said. Process server will reach his office between 2 and 3 this afternoon, she said. Once that happens, Evelyn, it's important that you understand what follows. He will call you. He will likely come home. He's going to want to talk, and he's going to want to talk immediately, and he is very good at talking. I know, I said. Whatever he says to you in the first hours, you don't engage. You listen, and you say as little as possible, and you do not allow him to draw you into a negotiation. That's what he'll try to do. He'll try to move you from a legal process into a personal conversation, because a personal conversation is territory he controls, and a legal process is territory he doesn't. I understand. Do you have somewhere you can go tonight if things become difficult at home? I thought of Natalie, of Connor. I hadn't told either of them yet. Not the full truth, not what I'd found. I'd been carrying it alone, and some part of me was aware that carrying it alone had been simultaneously my greatest protection and my most isolating choice. "I'll be fine at home," I said. A brief pause. I could hear Diane weighing that answer. "Call me if you need to," she said. "Any time." After I hung up, I sat in the Adirondack chair for a long time, not doing anything in particular. A robin landed on the edge of the garden bed, pulled something from the dirt, flew off. The oak tree moved slightly in a breeze I could barely feel from where I was sitting. I thought about 38 years, not as a lament, more the way you take inventory before a long trip, not to grieve what you're leaving behind, but to understand what you're carrying with you and what you need to set down. I had given this house 38 years of my life. I had painted every room at least twice. I knew where every draft came from in winter and which floorboard creaked and how long the hot water took to reach the upstairs bathroom. I knew this house the way you know a place that has been the container of your entire adult life, and I was going to have to leave it. Not today, but eventually. That was one of the things Diane and I had discussed without making it too explicit. In all likelihood, this house would need to be sold as part of the settlement. Too large, too expensive, too bound up in financial structures that would need to be untangled. I thought about leaving it, and I waited for the grief to arrive, and what came instead was something closer to relief. Because a house that has been built on a lie is not really a home. It's just a place where you lived while you didn't know the truth. He called at 2:58. I was in the kitchen making tea, and my regular cell phone buzzed on the counter, and I looked at the screen and saw his name, and took one slow breath before I answered. "Graham," I said. The silence on his end lasted almost 4 full seconds. That was notable. Graham Mercer did not do silences. He filled them. It was one of his core skills, the ability to inhabit any conversational pause with exactly the right word at exactly the right moment. A 4-second silence from Graham was the verbal equivalent of a man who'd just been hit somewhere he didn't expect. "What is this?" he said finally. His voice was controlled, but barely. Underneath the control, there was something I had never heard from him before, something that might, on another man, have been panic. "I think you know what it is," I said. "Evelyn." He said my name the way he said it when he was disappointed in me. Not angry, never openly angry, just carrying a weight of patient disappointment that had always, for 38 years, made me want to correct whatever I'd done wrong. "I need you to explain to me what you've done." "I filed for divorce," I said. "You've just been served with the papers." I can see that. The control in his voice was getting harder to maintain. I could hear it, the slight brittleness at the edges, like ice under pressure. "What I want to understand is why you would do something like this without even talking to me, without a single conversation." "I'm having a conversation with you now," I said. "This isn't—" He stopped, started again. "Come on, Evie. We've been married 38 years. Whatever's going on with you, whatever has upset you, we can talk about it. We don't need lawyers involved. You know how I feel about Graham," I said, and something in my voice must have been different from what he expected because he stopped mid-sentence. "I know about the accounts." Silence. "I know about the shell companies," I said. "I know about the property in Wisconsin and the offshore transfers. I know about Vanessa Holloway and what her role was. I know about the post-marital asset strategy." I paused. "I know about all of it." The silence this time was longer. 8, 9, 10 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the practiced warmth, the professional reassurance, all the instruments he used to manage other people's responses to him. What was underneath was harder to identify. Not guilt. I don't think Graham was capable of guilt in the traditional sense. Something more like recalibration. A man reassessing his position. "Where did you get that information?" he said. "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters." A flash of something sharper now. "Someone has been feeding you, so—" "No one fed me anything," I said. "I found it myself. I opened your safe." Another silence. "You went into my—" "I watched you open it one night," I said, "and I memorized the combination. And then one Saturday morning while you were at the club, I opened it, and I photographed everything inside." I heard his breathing change. Evelyn. The patience in his voice was entirely manufactured now. I could hear the machinery of it. Listen to me. What you're describing. I can explain all of those accounts. They're legitimate business structures. There's nothing illegal. You've clearly been given a very distorted— Graham, I said. Save it for your own attorney. I hung up. I want to be honest. Hanging up on him felt better than almost anything had in recent memory. There was something almost physically satisfying about it. Not because I was being cruel, but because for 38 years, hanging up, walking out, ending a conversation on my own terms had been essentially unavailable to me. Not because he'd forbidden it, because I'd been conditioned slowly and completely to believe that every conversation with Graham needed to conclude on his terms, with his explanation accepted, with his interpretation of events confirmed. Hanging up was a small thing. It felt enormous. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, then I picked up the phone again and called Natalie. She answered on the second ring. Mom? Everything okay? I need to talk to you, I said. And Connor, tonight, if possible. Can you both come to the house? A pause. I could almost hear her trying to read my voice for information. Mom, you're scaring me a little. Don't be scared, I said. I'm not, but there are things I need to tell you both, and I'd rather do it in person. We'll be there, she said. 7 o'clock. After I hung up with Natalie, I sat with the phone in my lap and thought about how to fill the hours between now and 7. Graham would come home before that. I was certain of it. He wouldn't stay at his office after this. He would need to come home, to be in his space, to reassert some kind of control over the environment, if not over the situation. I made a decision. I was not going to be there when he arrived. Not to run from him, not out of fear, but because the conversation that needed to happen between us needed to happen when I chose to have it, not when he showed up and demanded it. I packed a small bag, enough for one night, just in case. And I drove to a coffee shop about 4 miles away, and I sat by the window with a latte I didn't particularly want, and I did what I'd been meaning to do for weeks. I wrote it all down. Everything. From the bank statement under the pizza menu to Diane's office to Vanessa's face when I said Graham's name. The combination I'd memorized on the inside of my wrist, the handwriting in the planning documents, the line about E not being a sophisticated financial actor. I wrote it in a notebook I'd bought specifically for this purpose, and it took me almost 2 hours, and when I was done, my hand was cramping and my latte was cold, and there were 3 missed calls from Graham on my phone. I didn't call back. I got home at 6:30. Graham's car was in the driveway. All the lights on the ground floor were on, which he almost never did. He was fastidiously careful about electricity, turning off lights in empty rooms, always had been. Having all the lights on was a tell. He was unsettled, moving from room to room, unable to be still. I came in through the front door. He was in the living room, standing, not sitting, which was also unusual for Graham, who had always maintained his composure by maintaining his physical stillness, seated, measured, in control of his body even when other things were not in control. Standing in the middle of the living room with his jacket off and his tie loosened, he looked different than I was used to seeing him. He looked actually like a man his age. "Where have you been?" he said. "Out," I said. I set my bag down by the stairs. "I've been calling you for 4 hours, Evelyn." "I know," I said. "I needed some time." He pressed his lips together. He was trying to find the right register. I could see him working at it, the way a musician works at a difficult passage, trying to find the approach that would unlock me. Anger wouldn't work, and he knew it. Reasoning wasn't working. He was cycling through his repertoire. He landed on something close to hurt. 38 years, he said, and his voice was very quiet. "We've been together 38 years. You couldn't come to me? You couldn't have a conversation before you went to a lawyer?" "The same way you came to me before you opened the Wisconsin property account," I said, "or before you set up Clearfield Asset Management, or before you started moving our retirement funds through entities I'm not on?" His jaw tightened. "Those are legitimate business structures," he said. "You've said that already." "Because it's true." "Then your attorney will be able to explain them very clearly in discovery," I said. "I look forward to that." Something shifted in his face, a kind of calculation moving behind his eyes. I could see him revising his approach in real time, the way a chess player revises when a gambit hasn't worked. "Who have you been talking to?" he said, Jaman. "Someone has been—" "Graham." I sat down on the sofa. I made myself comfortable. "I need you to understand something. There is no version of this conversation where you explain your way out of what I found. The documents exist. They've been photographed and given to my attorney and reviewed by a forensic accountant. This isn't a misunderstanding. It isn't a distortion of the facts by some outside party who has an agenda against you." I looked at him steadily. "It's just the truth, and the truth has been in your safe for a long time." He stared at me, and for just a moment, for one brief, unguarded moment, the practiced face dropped entirely. What was underneath it was not what I expected. Not rage, not cold cunning, just something that looked very much like a man who has run a long race and arrived at the finish line to find that someone has moved it. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough," I said. He sat down then. Across from me in the armchair he always sat in, the one that was essentially his chair. Nobody else used it by unspoken household law. He sat in it and he put his elbows on his knees and he looked at the floor. "It wasn't," he started. "Don't," I said. He stopped. "Don't tell me it wasn't what it looks like," I said. "Don't tell me you were protecting us, or that you were planning something for our future, or that I wouldn't have understood the complexity of what you were doing. I've read the documents, Graham, including the ones that referred to me as someone who would accept whatever was presented as fair." My voice stayed even. I was proud of that. "So please, give me the courtesy of not insulting my intelligence on top of everything else." The room was very quiet. "I wasn't going to leave you penniless," he said finally. In a different voice, smaller, more stripped down. "That's not— I want you to know that wasn't the intent." I looked at him for a long moment. "What was the intent?" I said. He didn't answer, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing he'd said in years. Connor and Natalie arrived at 7:15. They came in together, which told me they'd coordinated beforehand, probably driving over together from wherever they'd met up, bracing each other for whatever this was. They walked into the living room and stopped. Graham was still in his chair. I was still on the sofa. The tension in the room was the kind that registers physically. You can feel it in your chest before you've processed it consciously. Natalie looked at me, then at her father, then back at me. Connor's face did the thing it always did when he was alarmed, went very still and very watchful, like a kid waiting to see which way a situation was going to fall. "Mom," Natalie said carefully, "what's going on?" "Sit down," I said. "Both of you." They sat, side by side on the love seat, the way they'd sat as kids waiting to find out what the verdict was on something. I had thought about how to do this. I'd thought about it for weeks, actually, not because I planned to have it happen tonight, but because I'd known it would need to happen eventually and I'd wanted to be ready. I'd wanted to have the words right, or as right as words can be for something like this. "I filed for divorce," I said. The silence that followed was different from the ones earlier in the evening. Those had been Graham's silences. This one belonged to my children, and it had a different texture, stunned rather than strategic, absorbing rather than calculating. "Mom," Connor started. "Let me finish," I said. "Please, I need to tell you both some things, and I need you to hear all of it before you ask questions." They looked at each other. Then they nodded. I told them. I told them about the bank statement under the pizza menu, about watching Graham open the safe, about the combination memorized on my wrist, about what I'd found inside, about Diane's office and the forensic accountant and Vanessa Holloway in Rockford, and the 2 hours in her visitor's chair while she told me about shell companies and exit strategies. I told them about the handwritten planning documents. I told them the specific line, about E not being a sophisticated financial actor who would accept whatever was presented as fair. I told them about the timeline, the target year, the property transfers, the offshore accounts, and then I told them the thing I had been holding until last, because it was the hardest thing to say and I needed everything else to be said first. When Natalie came to us in February, I said, and asked for help, Your father told us we were in a tight spot, that we couldn't afford it, that we had to protect our own retirement. I paused. He said that to your face, Natalie, while there was a safe in his office containing hundreds of thousands of dollars and a plan to ensure that as much of it as possible would never need to be shared with me. Natalie's face had gone very white. Connor was looking at his father. Graham had not moved from his chair. He was sitting in the same posture he'd been in since Diane's name was first mentioned. Elbows on knees, eyes down, the posture of a man who has understood that no available response is going to improve his situation and has, for once in his life, chosen silence. "Dad," Connor said. His voice was flat and very careful. "Is she right? Is that what happened?" Graham looked up. He looked at his son. "It's more complicated than—" "Dad!" Connor's voice didn't rise, but something in it closed. "Is she right?" Graham looked at the floor again. That was his answer. Natalie made a sound. It was very small and very contained. The sound of someone absorbing a blow they'd been half expecting and still hadn't been prepared for. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. "I asked you for $15,000, she said quietly. Her voice was shaking slightly, and she was fighting it. "I was trying to leave a bad marriage. I told you that. I sat in this room and told you I needed help getting out, and you looked at me." She stopped, pressed her hand to her mouth again. "You looked right at me, Dad, and you said you couldn't afford it." "Natalie," Graham said. "Don't," she said. Not loudly, but with a finality that shut him down completely. The room was quiet for a long time. Connor got up from the love seat. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, looking out at the dark backyard. I watched the set of his shoulders, that particular tension that men carry in their shoulders when they're trying not to let their face show what they're feeling. "Mom," he said without turning around, "what do you need from us right now?" It was such a simple question, such an exactly right question. I felt the first real crack in the composure I'd been maintaining for weeks. Not grief, not anger, but something more fundamental than either. The feeling of being known, of being asked the right question at the right moment by someone who loved me without condition. "Nothing right now," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. "I'm okay. I've been okay. I just needed you both to know the truth." Connor turned around. His face was composed, but his eyes weren't. He crossed the room and sat down beside me on the sofa and didn't say anything, just sat close enough that I could feel his shoulder against mine. Natalie looked at her father. "I want to understand something," she said. She'd stopped fighting the tremor in her voice, and it had steadied on its own, the way voices sometimes do when the emotion finds its direction. All those years of being careful and tightening the budget, and Mom not going back to work, and vacations we didn't take because it wasn't the right time, was any of it real? Or was it all just management? Graham didn't answer immediately. When he did, what he said was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said in the entire evening. "I did what I thought I needed to do," he said. Natalie looked at him for a long time. "That's not an answer," she said. "That's not even close to an answer." She stood up. She looked at me. "Mom, I'm going to stay tonight, if that's okay." "You don't have to," I said. "I want to." She went upstairs to her old room, the room she'd grown up in, the one I hadn't changed much since she left, the room with the window that overlooked the same backyard where she'd set up her little tea sets at age 4. I heard her footsteps on the stairs. Connor stayed beside me on the sofa. Graham hadn't moved from his chair. After a while, Graham got up. He walked to the stairs without speaking to either of us, and I heard his footsteps go down the hall to the master bedroom, heard the door close. Connor and I sat in the living room together. "Are you really okay, Mom?" he said when the house had been quiet for a few minutes. "I think so," I said. "I'm going to be. I'm so angry at him, I can't—" He stopped, pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead. "I don't have words for it right now." "You don't need words right now," I said. "That's what later is for." He laughed, a short, humorless sound that held more pain than humor. Then he leaned over and put his arm around me, and I let him, and we sat like that for a while in the quiet house. I was thinking about the safe, about what I needed to do, and when and how much longer I needed to wait. Diane had told me that once service was executed and the filing was official, I could deliver a personal copy however I chose. Service had been executed that afternoon. The filing was official. But I wanted to do it when the time was exactly right, when the weight of it would land the way it needed to land. Not in the chaos of this night, with children in the house and emotions running hot and everything raw and breaking. I wanted to do it in a moment of deliberateness, of intention. Graham had spent years being deliberate and intentional about what he hid in that safe. I could afford to wait a little longer to be deliberate and intentional about what I put in. Later, when Connor had fallen asleep on the sofa under the blanket I'd brought him, and the house was quiet and dark, and the clock in the hallway read just past midnight, I went to the kitchen. I made myself the kind of tea I never made for Graham because he didn't like the smell of it. A strong, cardamom-heavy blend I'd discovered years ago and loved, and quietly stopped buying because he'd wrinkle his nose at it. A very small thing. An absurdly small thing. But as I stood in the kitchen at midnight smelling cardamom, I thought about all the small things I had quietly stopped doing because they weren't what Graham preferred. The tea I didn't make, the music I turned down, the opinions I softened, the questions I stopped asking, the career I walked away from so gradually it didn't even feel like a departure. The woman I was at 23, who had a future mapped out that looked nothing like the future she got. I didn't hate him. I want to be clear about that because I think the story is simpler if I did. But I didn't. Hatred requires a kind of sustained focus that I wasn't able to maintain toward Graham, partly because hatred is exhausting and I needed my energy for other things, and partly because what I felt was something more nuanced than hate and harder to name. What I felt was grief for the wasted years, an anger at being lied to, and a very deep and complicated sadness for the person I had been, trusting, devoted, entirely certain she was loved as an equal. But underneath all of it, something new was beginning to grow. I could feel it, even that night, even in the kitchen at midnight, with my cardamom tea and my sleeping son in the next room and my daughter upstairs and my husband behind a closed door somewhere down the hall. Something that felt like the earliest possible stage of myself returning to myself. Not fixed, not healed, not whole, but present, awake, beginning. Done. 3 days later, Graham moved into the guest room without either of us explicitly discussing it. It just happened, the way certain things in long marriages happen, by implication and displacement rather than conversation. We were mostly quiet with each other during those days, not hostile. We'd been too long together for hostility to be our natural register, and besides, the children were still coming and going. Natalie was staying through the end of the week. Connor came by every evening after work. They were, in their way, circling the house protectively, which moved me more than I could say. Graham spoke to both of them. They spoke back. It was careful and civil and deeply strange. The new grammar of a family that had just learned a language it couldn't unlearn. He tried once more on the second evening to have the larger conversation with me. He knocked on the kitchen door frame, his own kitchen in his own house, and he knocked, which struck me as both pathetic and oddly appropriate. And he said, "Can we talk, just for a few minutes?" I said, "About what specifically?" He said, "About whether there's any way through this. That doesn't involve—" "No," I said, not unkindly, but clearly. He stood in the doorframe for a moment. "I never meant for you to be hurt," he said. I looked at him. This man I had made a life with. This man who had held my hand at our children's births and sat with me through my mother's death, and whose face I had watched across 38 years of breakfast tables. "I know you believe that," I said, "but intention doesn't undo consequence. You know that. It's basic accounting." Something moved across his face. I couldn't fully read it. He nodded once and went away. On the fourth day, I wrote the note. I sat at the kitchen table with a piece of stationery. The good kind, cream-colored with a small floral border that I'd had for years and never used because it seemed too nice for ordinary letters. And I thought about what I wanted to say. I'd had a lot of time to think about it. I didn't want it to be long. Long notes invite argument, interpretation, rebuttal. I wanted something that couldn't be argued with, something that simply stated what was true. I wrote it in 4 drafts. The first three were too long, too explanatory, too much like the woman I'd been. The one who always felt the need to justify herself, to make sure she'd been understood, to leave no room for misinterpretation. The fourth draft was 8 words. I found the truth before you realized I could. I read it back. It said everything. I folded the paper once and sealed it in an envelope. On the front, I didn't write his name. There was no need. He'd know. Archets. The evening I chose was a Thursday. Graham had a charity board meeting. I'd heard him confirm it on the phone. He left at 6:30, dressed in the dark navy suit he wore to formal functions. He said goodbye to me from the hallway. I said goodbye from the kitchen. The front door closed. I listened to his car back down the driveway. I waited 10 minutes. Then I walked down the hallway to his office. I had the divorce papers in a sealed envelope, my copy, officially stamped real, and the handwritten note. I placed the note on top of the papers inside a larger envelope, sealed that too. I stood in front of the filing cabinet. I put both hands on it and swung it out from the wall. The roller mechanism was just as smooth as before. The safe sat in the wall, dark and patient, waiting the way safes wait. Indifferent to what they hold, indifferent to who opens them. I dialed the combination. Left, right, left. The click was soft. I opened the door. The contents were exactly as they'd been when I'd first found them. The banded cash, the manila folders, the documents that represented years of careful, deliberate theft. His secret architecture. His hidden future. I placed my envelope on top of everything. The cream paper was very visible against the darker folders underneath. You could not miss it. You could not open this safe and not see it immediately. I took one slow breath. Then I closed the door, spun the dial, and moved the filing cabinet back into place. I went to the kitchen. I made tea. I sat at the table and I waited, and outside the window the evening light was doing what evening light does in June. Lingering, golden, reluctant to give way to dark. I had spent 38 years waiting for things I didn't know I was waiting for. A marriage that was real, a partnership that was equal, a man who saw me for what I actually was. This was different. This wait had an end I could see, and I knew exactly what was on the other side of it. The tea went cold before I finished it. I don't know how long I sat at that kitchen table after placing the envelope in the safe. Time does something strange when you're waiting for an irreversible thing. It stretches in certain places and compresses in others, and you find yourself noticing details you'd normally walk past without registering. The way the refrigerator hums with a slightly uneven rhythm, the way the kitchen light above the table throws a shadow across the salt shaker that makes it look larger than it is. The small brown water stain on the ceiling above the window that I'd been meaning to have repainted for 3 years and never did. I noticed all of it. I had nothing else to do but notice. Graham's board meeting typically ran until 9, sometimes 9:30. It was not quite 8 when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. Not his car. Something before that. The distant noise of the neighborhood, the particular acoustic quality of a summer evening on a suburban street, and then cutting through it, closer, the specific sound of our garage door. He was home early. I looked at the clock on the microwave, 8:07. My hands, which had been steady through everything, through opening the safe, through placing the envelope, through the weeks of careful maintenance of a normal-looking life, my hands were not entirely steady now. I noticed that. I put them flat on the table and pressed down slightly, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood under my palms. The door from the garage opened. I heard him set his keys on the small hook by the door. He always did that. Keys on the hook. The automatic tidiness of a man who controlled his environment through habit. I heard him walk down the short hall toward the kitchen. He appeared in the doorway. He still had his jacket on. He looked tired, more tired than the hour accounted for. There was something in his face that I hadn't seen when he left, a slight disturbance in the composure, like weather moving in at the edges. "Meeting ended early," he said. "I heard the garage," I said. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me in a way that was hard to parse. Not suspicious. Not yet. Just looking. "You're up late," he said. "Couldn't settle," I said. He nodded. He went to the cabinet above the refrigerator where he kept the good bourbon, poured himself 2 fingers without asking if I wanted anything, and stood at the counter drinking it. He was in one of his quiet moods, the kind that used to make me work to fill the silence, to ask the right questions, to coax him back to himself. I had spent years being the person who smoothed over his quiet moods. Tonight, I just sat at the table with my cold tea. "What was the meeting about?" I said, because it was the kind of question the woman I was supposed to be would ask. "Budget review. Boring." He swirled the bourbon. "Kessler talked for 45 minutes about the new donor database. I've sat through that presentation 3 times in 2 years." "Why'd you leave early?" "Headache," he said, "and I didn't want to sit through the reception afterward." He finished the bourbon. He rinsed the glass with the meticulousness that was one of his defining characteristics. Never leaving dishes in the sink, always rinsed and placed in the rack, even when he was tired, even when everything was falling apart. He rinsed the glass, placed it in the drying rack, dried his hands on the kitchen towel. "I'm going to check a few things in the office," he said, "then I'll be up." He walked out of the kitchen. I sat very still. I heard him walk down the hallway. I heard the office door open. I heard the familiar sounds of a man settling into his space, the creak of his desk chair, the soft percussion of papers being moved, and then silence. Not the regular silence of a man working, a different quality of silence altogether. The silence of something stopped. I counted my own heartbeats. I got to 11 before I heard the filing cabinet move. Ntit. The sound was distinctive once you knew what to listen for. The low mechanical roll of the cabinet swinging out from the wall on its hidden runners, smooth and deliberate. I'd heard it only twice before. Once from the hallway when I'd first discovered it, and once when I'd stood in front of it myself, putting both hands on the steel and pulling. I heard it now from the kitchen. Then the silence again. Longer this time. I stood up from the table. I didn't go to the office. I waited in the kitchen, standing near the counter with my cold tea behind me, and I waited for whatever came next. What came next was a long time arriving. It must have been 7 or 8 minutes, which is, if you've ever had to wait for something while your pulse runs faster than it should, an extremely long 7 or 8 minutes, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd misjudged, long enough that the edges of my certainty began to soften slightly. And then I heard him. Not his voice, his footsteps, coming down the hallway from the office in a way that was different from his normal walk, faster, less controlled, the sound of a man whose body is moving ahead of his composure. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding the envelope. It was open. He'd opened it. The cream-colored paper of my note was visible, half pulled from the envelope, and in his other hand were the divorce papers, the stamped official pages that Diane's office had prepared with meticulous care. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at me, and for the first and only time in 38 years of marriage, I saw Graham Mercer without his mask. Not the polished professional, not the reasonable husband, not the master strategist with an explanation for everything. Just a 63-year-old man standing in his own kitchen, holding the evidence of his own dismantling, and not knowing, for the first time in as long as I could remember, what to do next. "You put this in my safe," he said. "Yes," I said. "You went into my safe again and put—" "Yes, Graham. That's my private—" "Yes," I said. "I know. Just like the accounts were private, and the shell companies, and the property deeds, and the post-marital asset strategy." I kept my voice level. "I thought it was appropriate to leave it where you keep the things that are only yours." He stared at me. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was working through a calculation he hadn't completed yet. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said. And now there was something sharper in his voice, not the controlled disappointment of recent days, not the careful reasoning voice, something rawer than that. "I filed for divorce," I said. "I think I have a pretty clear idea." "You have filed against a man who has spent 40 years providing for this family," he said, "who has managed every financial complexity of our life, every tax issue, every investment decision, every decision about money that you made without me," I said. "Yes, you've done all of that. And apparently you've also spent a significant portion of those 40 years making sure that if you ever chose to leave, I would have as little as possible to show for them. That is not what... Graham. My voice didn't rise. I read the notes. I read your handwriting. Your actual handwriting in a document you titled, and I want to make sure I have this exactly right, a post-marital asset strategy. I know what it said, I know what it planned, I know the timeline, I know the target year. I looked at him. There's nothing left to explain. He put the papers down on the kitchen table. Slowly, deliberately, the way he placed things when he was trying to reestablish control through physical composure. He put them down, and he pulled out a chair, and he sat across from where I'd been sitting, and he folded his hands on the table, and he tried once more to find the version of himself that could manage this. I want to talk about what comes next, he said. His voice had found some steadiness again. Not its usual steadiness, but a reasonable approximation. Rationally, like adults who have been together for almost 4 decades. We can do that, I said, through our attorneys. Evelyn, that's not me being difficult, I said. That's me protecting myself, the way I should have been doing for a very long time. His hands, still folded on the table, tightened slightly. I saw it. Is this about Natalie? He said. Because if it's about the money I didn't give her, it's not about any one thing, I said. It's about all of it. It's about 38 years of managing my access to information about my own life. It's about being described in a planning document as someone who would accept whatever was presented as fair. I paused. It's about the fact that you looked our daughter in the eye and told her we couldn't afford to help her while you had a safe full of cash 20 feet away. The silence that followed that was different from the other silences of the evening. Heavier. More final. I never meant to, he started. You've said that, I told him. 3 times now. And I believe that you believe it. But Graham, what you meant and what you did are 2 separate things. And what you did is documented, extensively. He looked at the table. And then, because the evening hadn't finished delivering its surprises, we both heard the front door open. I had not called Natalie or Connor. I want to be clear about that because what happened next might sound staged, and it wasn't. What happened was simply that my daughter had been staying at a friend's place for the past 2 nights, but had left a jacket at the house that she needed for work the next morning. And she'd texted me around 7 to say she'd swing by to get it, and in the specific focus of the evening, I had completely forgotten about that text. So when the front door opened and Natalie's voice called out, "Mom, it's just me. I'll just grab the jacket and go." It was not a planned entrance. It was just my daughter. And she walked into the kitchen and stopped. She looked at her father, sitting at the table. She looked at me, standing by the counter. She looked at the papers on the table between us, the cream envelope, the official documents, everything right there in the open. "What's happening?" she said. "Nothing you need to be..." Graham started. "I left the divorce papers in your father's safe," I said, because Natalie deserved the truth, and I was finished with managed information. "He found them tonight." Natalie set her keys on the counter. She didn't go get her jacket. She sat down at the table, not next to me, not next to her father, at the end of it, equidistant, which I thought later was very Natalie. She always tried to hold the middle ground. She'd been doing it since she was a child, the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over. But her face tonight was not the face of someone trying to smooth things over. "Dad," she said, "have you told Mom you're sorry?" He looked at her. "It's more complicated than..." "Have you told her you're sorry?" she said again. Not a question the second time. Graham looked at his daughter for a long moment, and I watched something happen in him that I hadn't expected, a kind of fracturing, small and contained, like a hairline crack running through something that looked solid. He looked at Natalie, this daughter he had refused to help, and he seemed to see something in her face that the rest of the evening hadn't produced. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was quiet. "Evie, I am sorry." The room was very still. I looked at him. I let myself hear it, feel the weight of it, assess it honestly. "I believe that you're sorry," I said finally. "Right now, in this moment, I believe you mean that." He nodded. "But Graham," I said, "sorry doesn't rebuild what you took. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent not knowing. Sorry doesn't put my name on those accounts, or give Natalie the help she needed, or... I stopped, steadied. Sorry is a starting point. It's not enough to change what happens next. He didn't argue. That might have been the most significant moment of the entire evening. Not the papers, not the confrontation, not even the apology. The moment when Graham Mercer, who had an explanation for everything, sat at his own kitchen table and simply did not argue. Connor arrived 11 minutes later. He'd gotten a call from Natalie, who had quietly stepped into the hallway at some point and texted him the single sentence, "You need to come." He walked in still in his work clothes, tie loosened, looking like a man who'd driven faster than the speed limit to get somewhere he wasn't sure he was ready for. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his father. "Dad," he said. Just that. Graham looked at his son. Connor walked past him and stood beside me. He didn't touch me, just stood there, close, and looked across the table at his father with an expression that had none of the ambiguity of the earlier days. The careful neutrality, the trying to hold the middle ground that both my kids had been navigating, it was gone. What was there instead was something clear and sad and utterly resolved. "I need you to understand something," Connor said, and his voice was very even, the way voices get when someone has been rehearsing what they need to say on a fast drive across the city. Not right now as your son, as a person talking to another person." He paused. "What you did to Mom is the kind of thing that doesn't get explained away. You can't talk your way out of it. You can't restructure it into something else." He glanced at the papers on the table. "She found out. She hired a lawyer. That's done. But there's something else that needs to be said." Graham watched him. "You used us," Connor said. "You used Mom as cover for everything you built. You kept her financially dependent. You kept her in the dark. You used her whole life, her giving up her career, her running this house, her being available to you. You used all of it as the stable surface you could build your secret life on top of." His voice was still even, still quiet, but something underneath it was raw in a way that was hard to hear. "She paid for everything that safe contains, with her time, with her work, with her name not being on things it should have been on." He stopped. "That's what I need you to sit with." The kitchen was very quiet. Graham had both hands on the table, flat, not folded anymore. He was looking at his son with an expression that I had never seen on him before in 38 years. Not the performance of emotion, something closer to the real thing. "I know," he said. 2 words. No qualification. No explanation following. Connor looked at him for another moment, then he looked at me. "Mom, do you want us to stay?" "I'm fine," I said. "That's not what I asked." I looked at my son. This man who had gotten his father's height and his steadiness, but somewhere along the way had also gotten something Graham had never had, the willingness to sit in discomfort rather than manage it away. "Yes," I said, "stay." Graham went upstairs around 10. He said goodnight to his children in a voice that was stripped of all its usual qualities. No warmth, no authority, nothing performed. Just 2 syllables from a man at the end of a very long fall. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the guest room door close. The 3 of us sat in the kitchen together. Natalie made fresh tea, the good kind, the cardamom blend she'd noticed me drinking lately, the one Graham had always disliked. She made 3 cups and set them on the table without asking and sat back down. Connor wrapped his hands around his cup. "How long have you known?" he asked me. "Everything? About 2 months," I said. "The first piece, about almost 3 months." He nodded slowly. "And you've been sitting with all of that, alone." "I needed to be sure before I told anyone," I said. "I needed to have everything in order. If I told you earlier and then—" "You don't have to explain," Natalie said. "I understand why you didn't tell us." She looked at her cup. I keep thinking about you carrying that by yourself for all those weeks." "I had Diane," I said. "Your divorce attorney." "She was very kind," I said, and that made Natalie laugh. A short, startled laugh that had some tears in it. The kind of laugh that happens when the alternative is crying and laughter is slightly more manageable. Only you, Mom, she said. Only you would describe your divorce attorney as very kind. We sat with that for a moment. The kitchen felt different at this hour, the three of us around the table with our tea while the rest of the house was quiet, smaller and warmer than it did during the day, the way rooms do in the middle of the night when the people left awake are the ones who belong together. I need to tell you both something, I said. They looked at me. This house is probably going to be sold, I said, as part of the settlement. I don't know yet. Diane says it depends on a lot of factors, but I want you to be prepared for that, so you have time to grieve it if you need to. A brief silence. We grew up here, Connor said. Not a protest, just a statement. I know, I said. Where will you go? Natalie said. I don't know yet. Something smaller, something that's mine. I paused. I've been thinking about somewhere near water. A lake, maybe. I've always liked being near water. I hadn't actually said that out loud before, but it was true. I had thought about it, in the margins of all the other thinking, the image of somewhere quieter and smaller and entirely my own. A porch. A view of something natural and unhurried. That sounds good, Connor said. He said it simply, like he meant it. Natalie was looking at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression she'd worn as a little girl when she was trying to understand something that seemed too large for her. She'd grow very still and look at you with those serious dark eyes, and you could almost see the gears turning. Mom, she said, are you, and I really mean this, are you actually okay? Not performing okay. Actually. I considered the question honestly. I'm sad, I said. I'm angry, in layers. There are kinds of angry I haven't even gotten to yet, I think. I'm exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't quite fix. I wrapped my hands around my cup, but I also feel clearer than I have in years, which sounds strange given the circumstances. It doesn't sound strange, Connor said. I keep thinking about the person I was before all of this started, I said, before I found the bank statement. And I realized that woman, she wasn't fully awake. She'd made herself comfortable inside a story that wasn't entirely true, and she'd stopped asking questions because the questions made her life more complicated. And I have some things to reckon with about that, about my own part in letting things get to where they got. Mom, Natalie started. I'm not blaming myself, I said quickly. That's not what I mean. What he did was deliberate and wrong, and the responsibility for it is entirely his. I paused. But I stopped asking questions. I handed over information I should have kept. I let myself be managed because it was easier than being informed. And I need to understand that about myself. Not to punish myself, just to not repeat it. The kitchen was quiet. That's remarkably self-aware, Connor said finally, given that you just found out your husband has been financially deceiving you for decades. I've had time to think, I said. Apparently. We sat together until past midnight, not talking constantly, sometimes just being in the same space, the way families sit together when something large has happened and there are no words sufficient to address it, and the company itself has to be enough. When they finally said goodnight, Connor hugged me at the kitchen door for a long time. He's not usually a long hugger. He's more his father's child in that way, the brief backpat variety. But he held on that night, and I let him, and it was one of those embraces that does something for you that no conversation can. I'm coming back Saturday, he said when he let go. With food. We're going to figure out next steps. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I'll see you Saturday. Natalie kissed me on the cheek. She'd forgotten her jacket entirely. Text me if anything happens tonight, she said. Nothing's going to happen tonight, I said. Text me anyway. After they left, I stood in the quiet house and listened to it settle around me. The refrigerator hum, the clock, the particular late-night sounds of a house that has held a lot of life, and is still holding it, still standing, indifferent to the human drama contained inside its walls. I thought about Graham behind the guest room door. I thought about the safe, locked and dialed, with the manila folders and the cash in my envelope, empty now, its contents in Graham's hands, but the impression of it remaining, the fact of it. I thought about the combination. Left, right, left. The thing I had carried inside me for weeks like a stolen key. I had used it twice. The first time to understand what I was living inside, the second time to change it.
Both. The weeks that followed were not clean. I want to be honest about that because when you tell a story about leaving, there's always the temptation to make the leaving itself feel like relief. Pure and simple and immediately clarifying. It wasn't like that. It was painful in ways I hadn't anticipated and complicated in ways I should have expected. And there were mornings when I woke up and felt the absence of the life I'd thought I had, like a phantom limb. Graham and I were in the same house for 6 more weeks while the legal proceedings were underway and the financials were being sorted and the reality of 2 separate futures was being constructed. It was the strangest 6 weeks of my life. We were civil. We ate in different rooms, mostly. We navigated the shared spaces with a careful choreography that neither of us had designed, but both of us understood. There were moments, I won't pretend otherwise, when I looked at him across a room and caught the profile I'd fallen in love with at 23 and felt something that wasn't hate and wasn't love and didn't have a clean name. The weight of years. The specific grief of a life that turned out to be built on ground that was never as solid as it looked. He didn't try to talk me out of it again. After that Thursday night, he didn't argue or explain or appeal. He consulted his attorney, he provided what was required in discovery, and he moved through the house like a man who understood that he had forfeited certain rights by his own actions and was no longer in a position to dispute the terms. He tried once to tell me in the hallway one morning that he thought we could have been good together, that he wished things had gone differently. I stood in the hallway and I looked at him and I said, "Graham, we were only as good together as the foundation we were standing on, and you built that foundation on sand. You built it that way on purpose." He didn't respond. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. There was one afternoon in the 5th week that I need to tell you about because it mattered more than the legal proceedings or the financial revelations or even the confrontation in the kitchen. It was a Tuesday. Graham was out. A meeting with his attorney, I assumed. I was in the bedroom that had been ours for 38 years, beginning the slow process of sorting through what was mine and what wasn't, which is a strange and excavating exercise when you've shared a space with someone for that long. I found, in the back of the closet behind my winter coats, a box. I knew what it was before I opened it. I hadn't opened it in years, but I knew. I'd put it there myself, in one of those periodic house organizing purges, meaning to go through it properly and never quite getting around to it. Inside were things from before Graham, before the house, before the version of myself I'd been for 38 years, my teaching certificate still in its original paper folder, some photographs from college, a younger version of myself I barely recognized, grinning at a camera with her whole future unmarked in front of her, a journal I'd kept in my early 20s, full of plans for the classroom I was going to have, plans for the apartment I was going to decorate, plans for a woman who was going to be financially independent and professionally capable and entirely her own person. I sat on the edge of the bed and read through some of it. She was a good writer, that 23-year-old. She was funny and sharp and occasionally naive in ways that were charming rather than painful. She had opinions about things. She was interested in herself, curious about what she thought, what she wanted, what she would become. Somewhere between that journal and the kitchen table where I'd been sitting when I found the bank statement, a lot of that had gone quiet. Not taken from me, not stripped away overnight. Just gradually, gently, year by year, replaced with someone else's narrative about who I was and what I was for and how much space I should take up. I closed the journal and held it in my lap for a while. Then I packed it carefully in a bag I was keeping separate, the bag that was mine, that would come with me, that didn't belong to the settlement or the house or the marriage. That journal was coming with me. The woman in it wasn't gone. She was just, after a very long silence, beginning to clear her throat. Eek. The night before the movers were scheduled to take the first load of my things to a temporary rental I'd arranged, Graham knocked on the bedroom door frame. I'd been expecting him to. We'd had too many years between us for there to be no final conversation. I was wrapping books. There were a lot of them. I hadn't realized, until I started packing,
how many books were mine, and how few were shared. Another small thing. Another thing that was more revealing in retrospect than it had seemed at the time. "Can I come in?" he said. "Sure," I said. He stood in the room that had been ours and looked around at the half-dismantled version of it. The boxes along the wall, the bare nightstand on my side, the absence that was starting to make itself visible. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what Connor said, about you paying for everything in that safe." He paused. He was right. I wrapped another book without answering. "I told myself," he said slowly, "that I was protecting what we'd built, that the structures were insurance, in case things went wrong. I told myself it was pragmatic and not personal." "And now?" I said. "Now I think I was afraid," he said. "Of losing control. Of being in a situation I hadn't engineered. He stopped. "I'm not good at not being in control, Evie." "I know," I said. "I know that. What I didn't know was that I was part of what you needed to control." He didn't dispute it. "Will you be okay?" he said. "Financially, with the settlement?" "Diane tells me yes," I said. "I wasn't trying to—" "Graham." I set down the book I was holding and turned to look at him fully. "I know. I actually believe you were not consciously trying to leave me destitute. I think your plan was something more comfortable than that. A generous settlement that you controlled the terms of after a carefully managed separation where I didn't know what I had a right to." I looked at him steadily. "But that's still theft. It's more polite theft, but it's the same thing." He was quiet. "Take care of yourself," I said. And I meant it. Not warmly, but honestly. The way you mean it to someone who was once the center of your world and is now simply a person who will continue to exist somewhere beyond the borders of your life. He nodded. He left the doorway. I turned back to my books. Outside the window, the June evening was doing its reluctant thing with the light, holding on to it past the hour it should have faded. The oak tree was dark green against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was evening or night. I had planted things in this yard. I had grown children in this house. I had made a life here that was real even when the foundation of it was not. I was going to take what was real with me and leave the rest exactly where I'd found it. The rental was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Evanston, 4 blocks from the lake. I chose it because of the water. That was the only criterion that felt non-negotiable. That first week of looking, I needed to be able to walk to the lake. Everything else was secondary. The apartment itself was fine in the way that rental apartments are fine when you haven't yet accumulated the things that make a space feel inhabited. Adequate light, decent kitchen, a bathroom that didn't have anything wrong with it that I noticed immediately. The building was quiet. The neighbors I'd met in the hallway were polite in the way of people who respect other people's privacy, which suited me exactly. I moved in on a Saturday in July with Connor's truck and Natalie's organizational instincts and an embarrassing amount of kitchen equipment that Natalie kept trying to edit down, and I kept putting back in the box. "Mom, you have 4 colanders." "I use all 4. "Nobody uses 4 colanders." "I do." Connor, carrying a box labeled books, heavy in my handwriting, came through the door and looked at us. "Are we arguing about colanders?" "She has 4, Natalie said. "They're staying," I said. It was the most normal 20 minutes I'd had in months. We stood in that apartment, the 3 of us, surrounded by the pieces of a life being put back together in a different configuration, and we argued about colanders. And I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the chest rather than the throat, the kind that requires no performance. It felt like the first real thing I'd done in a very long time. The settlement was finalized in October. I won't walk you through all the legal mechanics, partly because Diane explained them to me over the course of several months in considerable detail, and I still don't fully understand everything, and partly because the specifics aren't what matter. What matters is the shape of the outcome. The forensic accountant had done his job thoroughly. Every account Graham had structured to be invisible, every shell company, every property deed that had been moved through Vanessa Holloway's registered entities, every offshore transfer. All of it came into the light under discovery. The term Diane used was fraudulent concealment, And she said it with the specific satisfaction of someone who does not get to use it often but has been waiting for the right case. Graham's attorney argued. Of course he did. Graham had retained one of the most expensive divorce attorneys in Cook County, which told me something about how seriously he'd understood his exposure. They argued that the structures were legitimate business entities, that they predated any marital discord, that I had been adequately provided for throughout the marriage. Diane dismantled every argument, methodically, thoroughly, with the documentation we'd assembled over months. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and an expression of permanent measured skepticism that I found deeply reassuring, looked at the post-marital asset strategy document, the handwritten one, with Graham's precise penmanship and his reference to E not being a sophisticated financial actor. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Graham over her reading glasses with an expression that required no translation. The settlement that followed was not what Graham had planned. The marital estate that was divided was substantially larger than it would have been if I had simply accepted whatever was presented as fair. The hidden accounts, the property, the investment portfolios that had been structured to disappear, they were included. All of them. Diane called me after the final hearing. It's done, she said. I was sitting on the bench at the end of the street that ran down to the lake. It was an October afternoon, the water gray and restless under a heavy sky, the kind of day that smells of cold coming. Okay, I said. You received a fair settlement, Evelyn. More than fair, actually, given what the estate turned out to contain. Thank you, I said. For everything. A pause on her end. Can I say something to you? As a person, not your attorney. Yes. I've been doing this for 22 years, she said. And I don't often say this, but watching you navigate this, the patience, the strategy, the way you never once let him pull you into his frame of the situation, it was something, she paused. You were smarter about this than most people half your age. I sat on the bench and looked at the gray water. I had a good teacher, I said. You taught yourself, she said. That's different. After I hung up, I sat there for a while longer. The wind off the lake was cold and direct, and I hadn't brought a heavy enough jacket. My ears were going numb. I sat there anyway. Done. It was a small word for the end of a 38-year marriage, for the closing of a chapter that had contained everything: children, seasons, the whole architecture of an adult life. Done felt inadequate. But it was also, in the way that simple words sometimes are, exactly right. Done meant over. Done meant the next thing could begin. I stood up from the bench and walked back to my apartment, into the warmth of a space that was only mine, and I made the cardamom tea, and I sat at my own kitchen table for the first time without anything to manage or conceal or maintain. I just sat. Chet, I want to tell you about Vanessa Holloway, because her story didn't end in October either, and she deserves more than a footnote. She cooperated fully with Diane's team. Every document, every entity structure, every record she'd signed her name to, she provided it all without being compelled. And her cooperation was, according to Diane, a significant reason the forensic picture came together as cleanly as it did. She submitted an affidavit to the court explaining her role and how it had evolved beyond what she'd initially understood she was agreeing to. She faced her own legal review as a result. I don't know the full details. That was between her and her own attorney. What I know is that she sent me a letter in September, handwritten on plain paper, that I read once and then put in the box with the journal from my 20s and the teaching certificate and the photographs of the person I'd been before. She wrote, I told myself for years that what wasn't my business wasn't my problem. I know now that isn't true. When you have the ability to tell someone the truth and you choose not to, you've made a choice. You've just made it quietly. I made that choice too many times. I'm sorry. I didn't write back. Not because I was angry at her. By October, I had run out of energy for anger that wasn't directly useful, but because I didn't know what to say that would be more honest than silence. She'd been part of the machinery that diminished me. She'd also been the person who handed me the documents that helped dismantle it. Both things were true. She had to live with both things. I didn't need to adjudicate them for her. I kept her letter because it said something true about the cost of convenient choices. I thought someday I might need to remember it. Graham sold the house in December. I drove past it once, about a week after the sale closed, not entirely sure why. Some impulse I didn't examine too closely. It was a cold afternoon, the kind of gray-white December sky that sits low over everything, and the house looked smaller than I remembered it. Or maybe I was larger. Maybe both things were true at once. There was a real estate sign in the front yard with the sold sticker across it at a diagonal. The oak tree was bare. The garden beds were empty and brown. The house was between people, not ours anymore, not yet the new owners. Just a building waiting to be inhabited. I sat in my car across the street and looked at it for a few minutes. I thought about Natalie learning to walk in the living room, Connor's dinosaur phase, and the ceramic triceratops that used to live on the windowsill in the kitchen. The first Thanksgiving we hosted after my mother passed, when I burned the rolls and cried about it, and Graham had, this was real, this happened, gotten in the car at 9 in the morning and driven to 3 different grocery stores looking for decent rolls and come home with a grocery bag and a bakery box and put his arms around me without saying anything. I thought about that. The thing about a marriage built partially on lies is that it doesn't make the true parts disappear. It complicates them. It puts them in a frame you didn't choose and didn't know you were standing inside. But they happened. The rolled-up grocery bag in his arms. The nights with sick children and the years of dinners and the specific, unrepeatable way that time accumulates between two people who have shared a life. I'd grieved the false parts. I still needed to figure out what to do with the true ones. I started the car and drove back to Evanston. I didn't drive past the house again. The watercolor class was Natalie's idea, technically. She'd seen a flyer in a coffee shop in my neighborhood and texted me a photo of it without comment. Just the photo. Which was very Natalie. She never pushed, just placed things in front of me and trusted me to know what to do with them. I signed up on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop, feeling faintly ridiculous. I hadn't taken an art class since high school. I had no particular reason to think I had any ability. The class was at the community center 3 blocks away, Tuesday evenings, taught by a woman named Bess who appeared in her website photo to be about 70 and was pictured holding a brush with the casual authority of someone who had been doing this for 50 years. I went. I was bad at it. This is important. I was genuinely, demonstrably, encouragingly bad at watercolor painting for the first 6 weeks of class. My washes were muddy. My proportions were wrong. I painted a still life of a pear that looked like something between a potato and a deflated football. Bess looked at it for a moment and said, "You're fighting the water. You have to let the water do what it wants to do and work with it, not against it." I went home and thought about that for 2 days. Letting things do what they want to do. Working with instead of against. Not controlling the outcome so tightly that you strangle it. I went back the following Tuesday and I was slightly less bad. By January, I was painting recognizable fruit. By March, I had moved on to landscapes. Nothing remarkable. Simple compositions, a tree line, a stretch of water. But mine. Made with my hands, in my time, for no other purpose than that I had chosen to make them. I started getting up earlier in the mornings to paint before the light changed. I bought better brushes. I ruined a lot of paper learning what each color did when it hit water at different concentrations. I discovered that I was not a patient person when it came to waiting for layers to dry, which cost me several paintings that might have been decent if I'd controlled myself. Bess told me once, watching me try to rush a wash that needed time, "Evelyn, the work tells you when it's ready. Your job is to listen." I wrote that down in the small notebook I'd started keeping in my jacket pocket. The work tells you when it's ready. Your job is to listen. I'd spent 38 years not listening to what the work was telling me, ignoring the damp feeling underfoot, the slight unevenness in the foundation, the small signs that the picture I was building didn't quite match what was actually there. I was listening now. In February, I had lunch with a woman from the watercolor class named Patricia, who was 68 and had been recently widowed and was trying out the class because her daughter had suggested it in exactly the same non-pushy Natalie way that my daughter had suggested it to me. We discovered over soup that we had approximately 6,000 things in common, including a love of cardamom tea and an inexplicable strong opinion about the correct way to fold towels, and a history of putting other people's preferences ahead of our own for so long that we'd both half forgotten what our own were. Patricia became my first real friend in what I was beginning to understand was my actual life. The life after, the one that was mine. We had lunch twice a month. We went to the Art Institute once and spent 2 hours in the Impressionism galleries and then 45 minutes eating sandwiches on a bench outside, arguing about whether Monet was a genius or simply very good at a very specific thing. We had different views. We argued cheerfully. Neither of us changed our minds. I had forgotten what it felt like to have an opinion without calculating how it would land on someone else. I was remembering. Connor called me one evening in March. It was a Thursday, and I was sitting on my couch with a glass of wine and a sketchbook, drafting a composition for the following Tuesday. "How are you actually doing?" he said. No preamble. Very Connor. "Better," I said. "Really better, not performance better." "I believe you," he said. "You sound different." "Different how?" A pause. "Lighter," he said. "Like there's more air in your voice, if that makes sense." It made complete sense. I told him so. "How's Dad?" I said. Because I could ask that now. Not without complication, but without the specific weight it had carried for months. "Fine," Connor said, carefully. "Working. He's been quieter than usual. I think he's doing some actual thinking, which is not a thing he's historically been great at." "Better late," I said. "I guess." A pause. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you regret it? Any of it? The marriage. Not what he did, but the choice to marry him. The years." I set the sketchbook down. It was the question I had been asking myself in various forms since October. Since before October, really, since the morning I'd opened the filing cabinet and found the safe. And I had an answer now. Not a simple one, but a real one. "No," I said. "I have you. I have Natalie. I have 38 years of a life that happened, that was real in the ways it was real. I regret what he did. I regret what I let myself not see." I paused. "But regret is expensive, Connor. It costs you the present to pay for the past, and I need the present right now." He was quiet for a moment. "That's pretty wise," he said. "I've been painting," I said. "It does something to your brain." He laughed. A real one. And I laughed too, and we talked for another hour about nothing in particular. His work, a book he was reading, a restaurant in his neighborhood, and it was just my son and I on the phone on a Thursday evening, easy and ordinary and entirely sufficient. After we hung up, I sat with the quiet of the apartment, the refrigerator hum, the distant sound of the lake, or what might have been the lake. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I was actually hearing it or just expecting to. I picked up the sketchbook again. Spring arrived late that year. It always does in Chicago. You wait through March and most of April for real warmth. And then one morning you walk outside and something in the air is different. Not just the temperature, but the quality of it. Something that feels almost like permission. I took the train down to the Loop one Saturday morning in late April and walked through the city for about 3 hours by myself. This was something I used to do when I was young. Before Graham, before the house and the children and the life I built. Just walk through the city without a destination, paying attention to things. I hadn't done it in decades. I realized, walking down Michigan Avenue with my jacket open and the spring air coming off the lake, done it because I'd stopped thinking of the city as something I navigated on my own terms. I'd been here as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's accompaniment. I'd stopped inhabiting my own routes. I walked for 3 hours. I bought coffee from a stand near the river and drank it sitting on a bench watching the boats. I went into a bookshop I'd never been in and spent 45 minutes reading the first pages of books I didn't buy. I sat in Millennium Park for a while and watched people. Nobody needed anything from me. Nobody was waiting for me to arrive or leave. I had no particular obligation for the entire afternoon except to exist and pay attention. It sounds small. It sounds like nothing. It felt like everything. I found the cottage in May. I hadn't been actively looking, not urgently. Diane had told me early on that the settlement would give me options, and I'd let that word, options, sit quietly in the back of my mind as a kind of banked reassurance. I wasn't ready to make a permanent decision in the first months. I wanted to live in the apartment for a while, let myself settle, learn what I actually wanted before I tried to build it. But in May, a friend of Patricia's mentioned a property on a small lake about 90 minutes north of the city. A cottage, she said. Small, a bit run down, owned by an elderly man whose children had finally convinced him to sell. It had been in his family for decades. Good bones, she said. Good water. I drove up on a Saturday morning with Patricia because she insisted on coming and because I secretly didn't want to go alone. The drive was through small towns and farmland and then into something prettier, the lakes region of northern Illinois, where the flat landscape gathers itself into gentle hills and the water appears suddenly between trees. I'd forgotten this part of the state. I hadn't been up here in years. The cottage was at the end of a gravel road on the eastern shore of a small lake. Not fancy. The exterior needed paint. One of the porch steps had gone soft. The garden had gone to weed and wildness. But the bones, as Patricia's friend had said, were good. The porch faced west, which meant evening light on the water. The kitchen was small and had a window above the sink that looked out at the tree line. The bedroom had slanted ceilings and original wood floors that were still beautiful under decades of scuff and wear. I stood on the porch and looked at the lake. The water was very still that morning, pale and silver in the early light, the far shore a dark line of trees. A bird was doing something complicated in the shallows near the dock. Patricia stood beside me. "Well?" she said. I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about the view from the backyard of the house I'd shared with Graham for 38 years. The oak tree, the fence, the garden beds I'd planted and tended and never quite thought of as entirely mine. I was thinking about the apartment in Evanston, adequate and sufficient and close enough to the lake to walk to. I was thinking about the woman in the journal from my 20s who had written about her future as if it were still entirely open, entirely hers. "I need to see the inside again," I said. We saw the inside again. I bought the cottage 6 weeks later. I want to tell you about the first evening I spent there alone, because I think it's important and because I've been building toward it without quite knowing it since the beginning of this story. It was a Tuesday in July, almost exactly 1 year since I'd moved into the Evanston apartment, exactly 15 months since I'd found the bank statement under the pizza menu in the hallway drawer. I'd been up to the cottage twice for work, repairs, fresh paint on the exterior, a new step on the porch, but this was the first night I'd sleep there. I'd brought a lamp, a good mattress, my kitchen things including all 4 colanders, my books, and my painting supplies. That was essentially it. The cottage was furnished sparsely with things I'd chosen at secondhand shops and a few pieces from the settlement. The reading chair I'd always considered mine, the kitchen table from the Evanston apartment. I made dinner. Something simple, pasta, a salad, bread from the bakery in the small town 6 miles down the road. I ate on the porch because the evening was warm and the mosquitoes hadn't found me yet. The lake was doing the thing it does at dusk in summer, going very still and very golden, reflecting the last of the light in a way that makes the water look solid, like you could walk out on it. The tree line on the far shore went dark while the sky above it was still bright, and for about 20 minutes the whole scene existed in that suspended state between day and evening where everything looks intentional. I sat on my porch with my pasta and I watched it. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about my daughter, who was doing well. She'd gotten through her own divorce with less financial complexity than mine, had a small apartment she was learning to love, was dating someone she described to me as aggressively normal in a good way. I thought about Connor, who called every Thursday and asked real questions and had recently started coming up to the cottage on weekends to fish off the dock with the focus of a man who needs an activity that asks nothing of him mentally. I thought about Patricia, who was coming up next month for a week, bringing her own painting supplies and strong opinions about breakfast. I thought about Graham. He was living in a downtown condo now. Connor had mentioned it, not at length, not with commentary, just in passing, as a fact. He was still working. His reputation in the financial community had taken a quiet hit. These things tend to circulate in professional circles, Diane had told me, without ever becoming fully public. He still sat on the charity boards. He He still played golf on Saturday mornings. His life, from the outside, probably looked largely intact. I knew something about how that worked. I hoped, in a complicated way that I didn't fully understand, that he was doing some of the thinking that Connor had suggested he might be capable of. Not for my sake. It was far too late for it to be for my sake, but for his own. Because a man who gets to the end of his life having spent most of it managing the people around him, rather than being present with them, is a man who arrives at the end alone in a way that no financial structure can protect against. I had been that kind of alone once, not because I was cold or controlling, the opposite. I had been alone because I'd made myself small enough to fit inside someone else's plans, and called it partnership. That kind of alone is its own particular quiet devastation. I hoped he found his way out of it. I hoped that more than I'd expected to. I was washing my plate at the kitchen sink, the one with the window above it that looked at the tree line, when my phone buzzed on the counter. A text. From Graham. I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. I miss you. 3 words, no preamble, just that. I stood at the sink with the phone in my wet hand and I read it twice. I thought about the woman who would have read those words 18 months ago. The woman who had spent 38 years wanting nothing more than to be genuinely seen and valued by the man she'd built her life with. That woman would have felt something seismic in her chest reading those 3 words, would have spent hours, days, turning them over, weighing them, wondering what they meant and what they were asking, and whether there was some path back to something salvageable. I knew what those words would have cost me once. I set the phone face down on the counter, not with anger, not dramatically, just with the simple, definitive gesture of a woman who has run out of time to spend on things that can't be changed. He missed me. I believed him. But missing someone and having treated them well are entirely different things, and only one of them creates a future. He'd had 38 years to choose that future, and he'd spent them building a different one, a solitary one, a controlled one in which I was an element to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. He had that future now. He'd built it himself. It was his. And I had mine. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I went back to the porch. The light had shifted while I was inside. The golden suspended moment had passed, and the lake was now the blue-gray of early evening, the tree line fully dark, the first stars appearing in the east. I sat in the chair I'd put on the porch specifically for evenings like this one. A good chair, solid, exactly the right height, that I'd found at an antique place in a small town and refinished myself over the course of 3 weekends with sandpaper and wood stain and 2 tutorial videos on YouTube. It had taken me much longer than it should have. It was not perfectly finished. There were places near the back leg where the stain was slightly uneven. I loved it more than almost any object I owned. I sat in it and looked at the lake and I thought, this is mine. This moment, this light, this water, this chair that took me too long to refinish, this silence that belongs to nobody but me, this evening at the beginning of the rest of whatever I have. Mine. Oh, there's something I want to say directly to you because I've been telling this story for a while now, and I think it owes you more than just the facts of what happened. If you are a woman who has handed over the information about your own life a little at a time, year by year, because it was easier than fighting for it, I see you. I was you. And I want you to know that the handing over is reversible. It is late sometimes. It is harder than it should be. The reclamation requires things of you that the original surrendering did not, but it is possible. If you're in a marriage or a relationship where your access to financial information is limited, where questions are managed rather than answered, where you have been gradually made to feel that asking too much is a kind of disloyalty, please hear this. That is not partnership. Partnership requires that both people can see the map. If only one person knows where the money is, only one person has the power. And power without accountability is not love. It never has been. I am not standing here telling you that leaving is always the answer. That's not my place, and it isn't my truth. My truth is that by the time I found what I found, the leaving was not a choice so much as an inevitability. The marriage had been over in the ways that mattered for a long time before I knew it. What I'm telling you is that knowing is always the answer. You are entitled to know the shape of your own financial life. You're entitled to your name on accounts that hold your marital wealth. You're entitled to ask questions and receive answers that are actually answers and not managed explanations. You're not too old to ask those questions. You are not too deep into a life to understand what that life actually contains. I found out the truth at 61. I started over at 61. I am, at 62, sitting on a porch overlooking a lake that I bought with money I was entitled to all along. It is not too late. It is never too late to understand what you're standing on. The wildflowers I planted along the south side of the cottage came up in August. A messy, exuberant riot of coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, and something purple that the woman at the nursery called Blazing Star, and that I called Beautiful. They came in faster than I'd expected, crowding each other, not organized, not tasteful, nothing like the careful garden beds I'd tended for decades in the yard on Maple Grove Drive. I loved them fiercely. Every morning that summer I walked out in the early light and looked at them before the dew dried off, and there was something about the sight of them, those completely unkempt, ungoverned, entirely themselves wildflowers, that did something to me I still don't have precise words for. They didn't need arranging. They didn't need managing. They just needed soil and light and water and room. That's not a metaphor. I mean it literally. But also, Connor came up the third weekend of August, and we sat on the dock until 11 at night with the lights of the far shore reflected on the water and talked about things we'd never quite gotten to before, was his childhood, what he remembered, the things he'd understood and the things he hadn't. He told me things that night that surprised me. Not terrible things, just the particular perspective of a child who had watched his parents from a different angle than I'd imagined. I always knew something was off, he said. Not accusatory, just factual. Not what it was, but the way you'd get quiet sometimes, the way you'd start to say something and then not say it. I didn't know I did that, I said. You did it a lot, he said. I used to wonder what you were not saying. I sat with that. I'm not saying things anymore, I said. I know, he said. It's good. It's different, but it's good. We sat in the dark and listened to the water. Natalie came the following weekend and we painted together on the porch. She was a beginner, worse than I'd been in my first weeks, which she found deeply frustrating and I found deeply enjoyable in the most loving possible way. I did not tell her to let the water do what it wanted to do. I figured she needed to arrive at that herself. We painted and we talked, and at some point she set her brush down and looked at me and said, "Mom, you look like yourself." What do I usually look like? She thought about it. Someone trying to look like herself. I understood exactly what she meant. One morning in late September, I woke up before dawn. This happens sometimes now. My body seems to have decided that early mornings are when things are clearest, which is inconvenient but also true. I made coffee and took it to the porch and sat in my refinished chair in the dark. The lake was invisible in the pre-dawn, just a sound, a presence, the smell of it. The sky above the tree line was beginning its slow shift from black to the particular deep blue that precedes actual light. I sat that there and I thought about the combination. Left, right, left. I don't know why it came to me then, in that specific quiet. But I sat with it for a moment, the way it had felt to stand in front of that safe with the knowledge I'd gathered, and the decision I'd made and the envelope in my hands. The way my hands had been completely still. I had been afraid, in the months before I found that combination, of what I would find. I had been more afraid, in some deep and unexamined way, of what my life would become if I found something that couldn't be unexplained. And here's what I know now. Sitting on a porch in the dark with coffee going cold in my hands, and a lake I can't see but can hear, and wildflowers sleeping in the bed along the south side of my house. The fear of knowing is almost always worse than the knowing itself, because the knowing, even when it's devastating, even when it changes everything, even when it costs you the structure of a life you'd believed in, the knowing gives you ground to stand on. Real ground. Ground that isn't borrowed from someone else's story about who you are and what you're worth and what you'll accept. Graham thought I would accept whatever was presented as fair. He had spent 38 years, carefully and deliberately, constructing a version of me in his mind that was small enough to manage, predictable enough to plan around, compliant enough to leave behind with minimal disruption. He got that wrong. Not because I'm exceptional, not because I did everything right. I didn't. I was late to look. I was late to question. I handed over more of my own life than I should have, for longer than I should have, because it felt like love, and because asking felt like disloyalty, and because I was afraid of what I'd find if I looked. He got it wrong because when I finally looked, when I finally stood in front of the thing I'd been afraid of and opened the door, I found something in myself that he hadn't accounted for, the capacity to begin again. The sky was lightening now, the blue softening toward gray, the tree line beginning to separate from the darkness above it. The lake appeared slowly out of the pre-dawn, gray and still and very wide. I watched it come into visibility. This is what I know at 62 that I didn't know at 23 or 40 or even 61. The most important thing you can own is not an account or a property or a settlement or a cottage on a lake, though all of those things matter, and I am grateful for every one of them. The most important thing you can own is the knowledge of who you are, not who someone decided you were, not who you became in the service of someone else's comfort, not the smaller, quieter, question-free version of yourself that's easier to manage, who you actually are underneath all that accommodation. I am Evelyn Mercer. I am 62 years old. I have 2 children who call me regularly and a friend named Patricia who argues with me about Monet and a cottage with wildflowers along the south wall and 4 colanders and a chair. I refinished myself and a lake that looks like silver in the early morning light. I paint things badly and I'm getting better. I ask questions now, all the questions, and I am, imperfectly, incompletely, with full knowledge of everything I did wrong and everything that was done wrong to me, I am entirely, finally, completely awake. The light came up over the tree line. The lake went silver. I drank my cold coffee and I watched it.